Good morning, everybody. Welcome to CRT offices here at Hatton for this joint session between Waterways and Canal River Trust. Firstly, can I thank CRT for actually agreeing to the session, so thank you, Richard, and also for their hospitality here today and providing venue and facilities. We have people obviously here in the room, and we also have, I think, about 14 or 15 people online who are observing the session. And the session will also be recorded, and the intention is to make that recording public at a later date. So just very briefly, can I just run very quickly around the room and actually get people to introduce themselves? I should have said, those who don't know me, I'm Les Etheridge. The chair of Canal River Waterways. Stupid idea of coming up with an idea in the first place, and then you end up digging a hole and fall into it, so that's my role. Richard sitting next to me, I'm sure everyone knows, but I'm Richard Parry, I'm the Chief Executive here at the Canal River Trust. Sue O'Hare, Deputy National Chair of IWA and IWA Representative on Britain's Waterways.
Liz Lowen, National Chair of the AWCC.
Andrew Fazy, I represent Royal Yachting Association on the FBW Steering Group.
Peter Brady, General Secretary of the National Association of Boat Companies.
John Sutherland, Editor of Nabo News, and I'm standing in for Rob.
Thank you. And I'm Anne Rizal, Chair of NABO, National Association of Boat.
Susie Mather, I'm the other member of the executive team from the Trust and the Communications and External Relations Director.
Yeah, no, it's IWA. Neil's here to take notes for us, so to help with it.
I'm Mike Wills, I'm Chair of IWA, or have been for the last 3 months roughly, so I'm still very much on a learning process.
Nigel Stevens, I run a plant fleet in Yorkshire on Awkward Waterways, and I'm on Navigation Advisory Group.
That's British Marine.
I'm not official British Marine.
I'm Joanna Richardson, Public Affairs Advisor for British Marine and a member of the FBW Steering Group.
Hi, I'm Anne Davis from Napton Narrowboats, representing British Marine and boating today.
Yeah, Robert Barton, Academic Minister of Canal River up in Cheshire, also sitting on the board of British Marine.
Thank you, President-elect of British Marine.
And did as well, yes.
And George is in the room helping us with the technical capacities and IWA stuff. Probably my partner, who's chair of the Waterways Cabaret Group, who's also helping with the technicalities. Anyway, with that, I'm going to just say I very much hope that today will be a positive and constructive session in which we can share thoughts and ideas in a really constructive manner. We all share a love or a desire to see the waterways properly funded, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that is the case. We know there are issues that need to be dealt with, and we know it's not an easy job. But having said that, I'm going to hand over to Richard for his introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Les. I'm really to echo what you've said. First of all, thank you to you and the Funding Britain's Waterways Coalition, if that's the right word, for organising today, but also for the campaigning work that you're doing. Thank you to all the guests in the room for making the trip here to join us. And obviously thanks to those online as well for spending, watching us too. One thing I want to say before I move quickly on to that, there's a lot we want to cover, is to really echo what you've said about this being a constructive engagement with this. About our canal network and our very determined fight for its future to secure the funding it needs. Part of that process is us to be open and transparent about what we're doing, to disclose as much information as we reasonably can about how we're going about discharging our responsibilities as the navigation authority, as the custodian of this amazing 2,000-mile network that we're responsible for. As you know, about 2/3 of the inland waterways in England and Wales. And I'm here today to try and answer the questions that were sent in as much detail as I can, given the constraints of time that we inevitably will face. My plea, I guess, is to remember the bigger picture, that we all want the same thing. There will be some issues, I'm sure, where we have slightly different perspective, and it's our job to try to give you the information that will help us kind of bring us towards some greater alignment, but I am sure in the course of the next 2.5 to 3 hours, we won't entirely achieve that. And my plea is, let's remember that bigger picture. Let's not let the small differences amongst us in any way, turn this into an interrogation about some small matter. Actually, what we want to do is to provide enough information for us all to be joined up together in campaigning for the big prize, which is the long-term sustainable funding that our amazing historic network needs. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you, Richard. I should have said at the start, the Fundraising Waterways, of course, is not just about Canal River Trust, it's also about all the waterways and the importance of getting them all properly funded, because the benefits that we all know that the waterways provide aren't just on Canal River Trust, waters, they're not just on the environment agencies, waterways, but there's more navigation authorities around the country than I can ever remember. And soon he comes to my rescue here, but it's more than 200 navigation authorities, and how what affects the bigger one knocks on into the smaller ones. I should also say thank you very much to everyone who has submitted questions for today. We have 10 in total. We've had to collate them. It wouldn't have been possible to put, I don't know how many questions there were, but we've put them together as best we can. In the timescale I've worked out, I like working numbers out because that's what I'm good at. We've got basically 12 minutes a question. I know some will take longer and some will take shorter, so I'm going to try and move it along on that basis. Also intending after question 4, I hope to take a short break so that we can do whatever we need to do at that stage. Have a cup of tea, I guess. So I'm thinking that will come at about 11:30. So, having said that, can we move on to question 1, which will now appear on the screen, hopefully. I'm going to hand over to Roger and start looking at my watch to over 12 minutes or so.
Richard, okay, good. I was just like one of your modules for a moment.
Okay. Slightly worried.
Yeah. Call me what you like. Within reason. I mean, we could easily spend the 3 hours on this. I will attempt to give a high-level view, and then, of course, you can, I'm sure those of you in the room want to come back on the specific things. So clearly, we are a broad, big, fairly complex organisation doing an awful lot of different things. Over time, we've evolved to a position where, like many large organisations, particularly infrastructure, network organisations, we have a mix of in-house expertise and outsourced or contractor supply chain activities. We manage that pretty actively. It hasn't broadly changed since 2012 when the trust was created. So, of course, we didn't land out of a clear blue sky. We inherited a lot of the ways that British Waterways had over time itself evolved to do things. But we have made sure we've been actively managing that. We have, I think, a very good procurement team that's largely consists of people we've recruited to make sure we have now, I think, a very professional, systematic process of awarding tendering contracts. I have a copy of a kind of process that we run, which I can let you all have in the room, just to give you some sort of assurance around the way that we approach this. And we've actually driven quite a lot of value out of the way we've retendered and contracted over time. So, again, a good track record of savings being delivered. Of course, placing the contract is just the first sort of part of this sort of life cycle. And clearly, we need to have robust contract management as well. To answer the question more specifically on overseeing and signing off, this process includes that, but obviously we work within a scheme of delegation set out in the articles of our kind of board governance, so high level, in value terms, decisions will need board approval, and then it will cascade down. I have authority for a certain size, and some of the very small contracts don't need to come to me, you would expect. I'm not quite sure what timescales means, but to be clear, our tender process does set out timescales for ensuring that we have time and space to make good decisions ahead of needing to place contracts where that is possible. Quality control.
Sorry, I could have explained that better in my courage. The idea of timescales was about how to actually agree a timescale for a job.
Okay. Well, I guess it's a big excuse to say, of course, this is all size and shapes, isn't it? So maybe in the way the question's framed, there's a view that is about, I don't know, canal maintenance or projects to deliver repairs. Of course, we have outsourcing for a whole variety of different things, some of which are very regular routine things. So, I mean, a most clear example of that is our vegetation contracts. So, we we would have a very different way of managing that, because we'd be setting a spec over time for the contractor to deliver, rather than, you know, agreeing a piece of work, you know, item by item. But for those items where we do place a contract, we're largely talking, if you think about maintenance, construction, repair work. Again, slight aside, we used to have a single framework contract with Kia. We have, in recent times, broadened that, so we now have two major complex framework contracts with Kia and Bentley, and a second tier of largely smaller, not actually necessarily smaller, but other contractors who we call upon to do some of the perhaps less complex works. So that gives us more choice, and we think therefore better benchmarking if we wanted to, you know, a little bit more competition around the way those contracts interact. So that's the sort of situation we've evolved towards. And for each job, there will be a process of setting, depending on which form of contract we use, because this gets slightly complex in the way the contracts work. But in essence, we would look at a planned piece of work, we would ask Kia for a cost on a program, or Bentley, or whoever it is that we're working with, and there would be then some prior sort of negotiation around that. So we were satisfied with the timescale, with the price that's been set, and any other parameters. One of the things that we've strengthened in recent years has been we now have an in-house cost intelligence function. So when we did a pretty deep review of the way we were delivering our major projects, we identified that we could potentially be stronger in terms of having our own insight into what some of these fairly standard pieces of work would cost. Of course, our network is lots of peculiarities that mean there's always a degree of discretion has to be applied to that. But nevertheless, we have a much better insight now into what we would expect things to cost, and therefore a much stronger basis for a discussion with the contractor prior to placing the contract for that particular job. And again, the timescale does depend. Of course, it depends on the nature of the job, the novelty of the job, if you like, the conditions, how much information have you got about it, do we have a design ready, or are we asking for design as part of it? It really does depend on the nature of the piece of work we're talking about.
So there is a detailed process rather than it's chucked out to the contractor.
There is, again, to come back to in all this, I would want to assure you we are very professional in how we do this. You know, it's not to say we always get everything right, and there's a caveat attached to almost all the answers I give to everything. Of course, we're in a real world with lots of factors that can interfere or distract or cause us difficulties. You know, we inevitably have lots of external interfaces that can complicate things as well. But yes, we would make sure that we have a kind of a planned work and approach to it. It's worth a quick word about unplanned work, of which we have had quite a lot in the last few months. Clearly, you don't have the luxury of working through a kind of a time scale. You need to get in there and start fixing it. So we have a different way of using our framework contracts, which is like a cost plus. Now, we don't like cost plus that much because, of course, it means the contractor is kind of doing the work and you're funding it as they do it without having had the opportunity for that kind of commercial, well, not necessarily negotiation, but that clarity commercially up front. However, you would all, I'm sure, want us to get in there and start fixing things pronto, so we just have to work on that basis. For a very difficult repair, we would try to move from a cost plus to a target cost arrangement at some point during that work, so that we, you know, get the immediate problem managed, and then if it's going to need a long-term repair, so for example, we might do something just to stabilise the canal and then plan to come back in a few months, we would then use that time to try and move to a different form of contract. Quality control, again, lots of dimensions of this. Clearly, we would want to assure ourselves that we were getting value in the quality of the output for the money that we're spending. Again, that very much depends on, is it a major reservoir project, or is it someone cutting the grass, and there's a different approach to all of that. Each of our regions has a contract supervisor role, whose job it is to, for those sort of day-to-day operational contracts, of which we have a number, for them to work with the contractors to get assurance on quality. In our major projects, we have, again, part of that framework contract role is to be seeking, you know, assurance on quality. You then, of course, to move on to the next question, do inevitably end up, particularly on some of the major contracts with commercial issues. So if a risk emerges, there's always a commercial discussion about, well, was that foreseeable? Should that have been part of the contractor's prior, cost estimate? Or is it genuinely an arising, unexpected piece of information that wasn't there? That actually you drain the canal and find that the structural problem is much bigger than anyone could have reasonably known before you drain the canal, etc. And so we do then have a process for, what do we call them, CEs, what does that stand for? Effectively, contract variations, where the contractor will say, outside of my target cost, I have now found this variation that I need to price for. And that will then often be put to one side while the work is delivered, and then there can often be quite a long, drawn-out commercial discussion about where responsibility for that sits. And again, clearly all that's commercially sensitive, so we won't necessarily be publishing all of that, but just to assure you, there is a very robust process of agreeing the end cost for a job to reflect, what ultimately has to be a fairly pragmatic balance of these things. So we won't do ground easily, but clearly we're in a long-term partnership with these contractors and need to find a collaborative way of working so that, in the kind of cliche, people leave the contract in the drawer, get on with the job, unless and until you need it. And that's clearly not just what happens at the trust, that would happen in any other major infrastructure or indeed any other type of project delivery model. So in that sense, we would look where clearly the contractor's oversight, that they would be responsible for the cost, and indeed, if they have done unsatisfactory work, we would expect them to fund its reinstatement or the correction to it. That can be as simple as, if someone hasn't cut the grass very well, our contract supervisor will say, you've missed this, you need to fund going back to fix that. So that's kind of the very routine day-to-day stuff. Clearly, where it's at the major project level, it's a more challenging conversation about going back and repairing something, but that will be happening within that commercial discussion.
Okay.
Well, yes, please do.
First of all, declare slight interest. As business, we do work with CRTs, we are subcontractors, so declare that interest early. But the question in my mind was, the world where it's like funding from over here, isn't it? And hopefully contracts is hoping to drive down costs and be more efficient. Yeah. But in the world where over the last 10 years, you've got X amount of lots to repair, you've got X amount of grass to cut 4, 5, 6, 10 times a year. As things get squeezed, where do you see the sort of savings coming from? Is it because the grass there's often repairing, I suppose, bridges? Where's the next efficiency coming from, or the saving coming from?
Yeah,
contracts.
Big question. Clearly, we're very mindful of getting, this word value, there's a lot of work, doesn't it? Value in a broad sense. Where for the funds are available, should the priorities go? Yeah. And that's a pretty complex set of parameters you're looking at. Do you do fewer lock gates? Or do you cut the grass less? Or do you try and push a project back a year that you might need to do now? What are all the other things that you can try and find savings on? So it's a constant feature of our business planning. The one thing I would just perhaps share, because it is relevant to some of the questions about choices we're making. Clearly, growing volunteers is giving us another option here. So particularly on some of the, what's the right word, things like off-site vegetation, which are a challenge for us to fund through a contractual model. We're increasingly getting volunteers equipped, trained to do that sort of thing. That enables us to stretch the money a little bit further sometimes, because we can do things using different delivery routes, so much the better. But there kind of isn't really a simple answer to your question. It's, we are having to look intensively at all the things we do to unlock whatever value we can. So we will look at some ongoing costs, whether that is vegetation, whether that's any other activities that we do, to see if we can find better, cheaper ways of doing it.
That's in the right questions.
Okay, so come back to that there. I think I want to question F on your subset questions, Les. And again, it's quite a big thing to give you a pithy answer to. So our model, which will come on to more with the asset management question, is that we have a whole enormous long list of notifications. So we have our asset management regime involved, asset inspectors constantly active around the network, observing, recording, as well as obviously other bits of feedback we gather sometimes from the public or yourselves on occasion, and that all go into the kind of how do we allocate our resource on a day-to-day basis. We try very hard to keep the planned work discrete and planned, as in we don't want to have a whole lot of planning done and then throw everything up in the air, and all that planning is sort of effectively wasted, and we're doing something else without the benefit of having done that planning. So we try to get stability in our plan. So through this autumn, our engineers will be working out very, very carefully, lots of robust discussions, what the priority for spend in 2025 would be, and we will try and stick with that. Inevitably, the margins will have to vary because stuff happens. When we have an unplanned intervention, so someone reports a failure, we will drop onto it as quickly as we can. One of the things we've evolved in our larger regions is to have a reactive team in place. So that gives us a sort of standing body of people who can respond more quickly than we perhaps could have done in the past. And that's proven invaluable to have that resource. But of course, there's a trade-off between how much that's costing versus how much other interventions, planned interventions, etc., would cost. I'm conscious I'm slightly talking around this one, but it's a process of evaluating constantly where the most immediate priority is. Clearly, anything that's closing navigation will be assumed to be a priority, and we will drop onto it somehow using that reactive team or by diverting one of our planned work teams if we have to, or by bringing in a contractor if we think they have the capacity and capability to do it, and obviously if we have the funds available, although we'll obviously prioritise making the funds available. And that kind of is the organic way that we go about managing the network as best we can to keep it open, driving ourselves to do whatever we can to get the navigation back open as the priority, because we know the impact it has if it remains closed for a longer period. How much delays in dealing with failures add to the cost? Well, again, this is the sort of, I suppose, perfect world versus real world stuff, isn't it? Yes, perfect world, we would have the insight and the capacity to respond to all failures, immediately. In the real world of the finite resources that we've got, there are some problems that we don't think are quite so critical, or maybe they're emergent problems, and we will make the judgment that can be put off, maybe with some mitigation in place, which might just be additional inspections, or it might be some temporary repair if we can identify something, and then it'll go into the kind of process of planning for the longer term. Is a more permanent intervention there, justified against all the other things that we've got to do, and that's where our business planning, so the long-term asset management, hoovers up all of those failures or notifications. We clearly would again prioritise navigation and safety, because again, if anything is a safety risk to the public, then clearly that's something we would be prioritising, resolving quickly. If there's something that is, and I'm sure you can all think of countless examples, we might have had a bit of collapsed wash wall or something, it's not interfering with navigation right now, it clearly can't be left forever, but actually it probably is a priority against something that is a more immediate risk to closure, and so that calculation will have been made, that judgment will be made. Thank you, okay?
We're sort of very close to the 12
Yeah,
minutes.
sorry.
So, sorry, but on that last point about what strategy you have in place to improve your reactive maintenance going forward, could you just say?
Well, I didn't answer that, you're right. So again, I guess our raison d'etre is to seek to improve. So it's not a static thing, as in, reactive maintenance is one thing now, and it needs to be this other thing. Clearly, there's always incremental improvement you can make. And so that is about recognising where there is value in doing planned preventative maintenance. So we do have a programme of planned preventative maintenance on those assets where we believe the investment of time in doing that offset potential failure and potential disruption, and therefore, from an asset management point of view, is a good use of resource. will typically be around sort of lock paddle gear and things like that, but it will be beyond that as well. It'll offer the RMNE structures and other things where, you know, stitching time saves 9 as the questions have been applied. We are looking again at our model for how we would react to things once they are, you know, they're moving towards a failure mode. And as I said, we're creating reactive teams as part of that. We're, you know, on an ongoing basis reviewing, have we got that balance right? You know, have we got them in all the right areas? Have we got enough skills to be able to resolve things? Do we have the right supply chain to help us resolve things? It's a pretty constant ongoing process to sort of sense check our current performance and to see if we think there's anything we can do within what we can afford to try and find some incremental improvement.
Yeah,
One more question.
I'm not sure if it's quite the right place to ask this, but what we have inevitably at the moment is an awful lot of repair on failure. And I think this question was asking how much more does that cost. But the reason we have this is because there isn't enough stoppages, and the reason there isn't enough stoppages is because of reservoirs, and there's nothing you can do about that. We've all got to live through it. But it is an interesting experiment, because what we are discovering is that everything breaks if it hasn't been fixed before it breaks. And this is a vicious circle, and it goes round and round. And living in a part of the country where we haven't got a Jeff Smith to go and fix it, it's been awful.
Jeff heads up our North West Reactive Team, just for those who don't know.
What we don't have one of.
I mean, without getting philosophical, we'll come back to asset management later tonight. I mean, I know you think deeply about these things. Good asset management is always getting there just in time, isn't it? So if you're getting there way too early, you're wasting a lot of money. If you're getting there too late, you're causing a lot of disruption, as well as all the additional cost of having to react, you know, from a standing start rather than a plan. So we're constantly trying to, you know, get that balance right and just make the intervention, replace that lock gate or repair that, whatever bit of wall, that quadrant, whatever it is, just in the nick of time. But we're always going to get it wrong. You know, inevitably you'll get some of it wrong. And you're right, when we are under pressure financially, clearly you're having to spread that thinner, and the thinner you're spreading it, the more risk you are creating in the performance of those assets. So, you know, your broad observation is right. I think we are spending a lot more than we were to accommodate some of the reservoirs, so it's not eaten entirely into our kind of core maintenance work, but inevitably there's a tension there, and I do appreciate that, you know, the east end of Rochdale is somewhere where that tension manifests itself.
I was thinking which is the normal waterway. But we're at the phase in the experiment where you're having to rush around where you would rather have been planned.
Yeah.
The next phase in the experiment, as money gets tighter, is that you don't repair on failure, or you repair long after failure. That would be something which you would be desperate to avoid, but which you might not be able to. And I think that that is an interesting thing to focus on how to avoid, which means more money, obviously. And that sort of thing.
So back to the same thing.
And again, there's a sort of question later on, which tends to come back to that as well, I think. So it's a very, very, very powerful question. I'm sure Richard will follow up. So should we pass on to question 2?
Okay. You might have to take question 1. We'll try again question 2. Okay, so I said a slightly more kind of critical underlying. I suppose I'm going to answer quite robustly by saying I think everything we're doing is about well-being. I think we may have crystallised that in using the word more scholarly. At the time we kind of revisited some of our branding and our marketing and our strategy in 2018. But everything we do is about well-being. So being perhaps a little silly, I would say the spending on well-being is 225 million that we spend on the network. That kind of is all going to me to providing a amazing experience for all the people. I mean, you know, I remember conversations with people who started voting in the 1960s. There I said 1 or 2 might even be in the room today, who said, actually, I did it because I feel happier and it makes me feel better. And there you are, that's the magic word well-being. And of course, we define well-being very broadly. So if it generates jobs in the area, if it improves the environment in the area, that is adding to the overall well-being of the nation. You can see the words used in the Welsh Government legislation to make that point forward. So that's what I would say. If the question is really about two things, I guess, one is, when we rebranded, was it worth it? And I would argue, yes, it's unlocked an awful lot more opportunity for us. We've seen very significant growth in usage of the waterways, growth in awareness. We certainly believe we've opened a lot more partnerships. A lot of that will lead potentially to more funding. So I think the emphasis on the broader role that our canal network, waterway network can play, to move it away, if it was ever true from a narrow, well, it's industrial heritage, it's about the past, and it's about a few people on boats. If people ever thought that, it was really important to kind of blow that up and make very clear, no. It's a network providing all this opportunity for benefit, happiness, better health, etc., for millions of people with green, blue space on the doorstep, urban areas, the stuff we all talk about, I think. So I think the investment in creating that narrative has been very worthwhile. We've seen very strong growth, as I say, there's a whole set of measures. We spent a little bit of money rebranding, that being pointing out, because IWA has also done some rebranding since we did ours, so we're all kind of recognising a refresh and something that sort of changes perhaps the way you can position yourself can be helpful. And as I say, I think we can draw a line that says it really has been important in unlocking lots more opportunities for us. The other word that I think we mean by wellbeing is maybe more community engagement around towpath use and other such things. And I suppose I do want to just give you the assurance, very little of our core funding goes towards that. So what we've been able to unlock is lots of other funding. Yes, for things like towpath resurfacing through active travel England and Sustrans and local authorities and towns funds and goodness knows what. But also through partnerships with people like Sport England, who are funding quite a lot of our participation work. We've been a partner on social prescribing projects, again funded. And yes, we haven't quite got to the point where some of that funding goes right back around the circle and funds the core infrastructure. And I guess that's when we're really making the positives of this demonstrable. But it has undoubtedly meant that we have brought in additional money to bring waterways to life and create the virtuous circle that makes it clear to government and other funders how important the long-term sustainable funding for these waterways, this canal network is. So I guess broadly that's my defence of what we have done. Relatively small investments, always quite hard to say how much of it was new investment, how much was ongoing marketing or ongoing signage replacement and the like. Yes, okay, we probably had to bring some of that forward and inject a little bit more at a point in time, but really, in the scheme of things, it's a very, very small proportion of what we're spending, and I believe it's paid for itself in unlocking that other funding and widening our narrative about the benefits we can deliver. We talk a lot about quantifying those benefits. You've all seen the reports we've put out, our impact report that came out a few weeks ago. All of that is telling the story about how important it is for a much, much wider set of audiences and benefits. And that magic word well-being probably will make quite a front and centre in our narrative going forward. It's probably done its job, but that broad definition is really important to what all of us are trying to demonstrate.
Your opening comment about well-being and some of us might start budgeting in the 1960s. I'm in a year that's fine, it started in 1971. But seriously, I totally accept. I would remember in days at work that when I could get on the boat for 2 weeks away, I always remember the first day on the boat, I was still going 100 miles an hour and this, that, and the other. And by about day 2, I'd suddenly gone into a different world where I could actually see what was around me. So I fully accept that point. I think some of the scepticism here comes not from the past, which is, I think everyone knows the value of inflation reference here. I think it's sometimes this comes with a sort of blue side and say woof and things like that, or that money over the organisation. I think that's sometimes where I think people think there's a lot of money has been wasted on well-being. Yeah, and I agree. 1971, I have as well-being. I don't know.
And on the side issue, one of the response I do get, and as I've had it with some people in the room, is why you're spending money on blue signs. And we need people to know who we are. You know, although we've seen awareness rise, it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And you know, it's an obvious truth, isn't it? If people know who you are, they can hardly expect to support you or advocate for you, or all the other things we need them to do. So most of that's happening digitally, so it's not, you know, places where you will see it on the network itself. But it is really important that the 10 million plus people who are accessing the network regularly do know who they should support if they want to keep the thing that they're enjoying and valuing and benefiting from available and open and in the attractive condition they want it to be. So in a sense, I make no apology for us being a bit more forward with our communication about us, that we're the custodians of this stuff. And I hope I can persuade you that it's in all our interest to do that.
Can I just pick you up on what you just said? Probably done its job.
Yeah.
So in that case, how much funding are you looking at saving in the next 2 years because it's done its job? And how will you do that? What will you cut back on? What will you see being saved?
I guess maybe I should do more the present participle. It is doing its job, okay? I don't think it's done its job, put to bed, until we have all 10 million people in some form or other acknowledging who we are and what we do and supporting it. There's still work to do. So we will continue to do that, but of course we're more in a sort of an ongoing, we might call steady state arrangement than some new sort of launch thing. We don't spend actually that much on things like our marketing and social media compared with others. You know, we do some benchmarking around that, and I think we get very good return for that, and we would want to continue that. So some of the, you know, the campaigns that we've run, I think, are very worthwhile, and we would want to continue refreshing them and, you know, doing them differently. We get tremendous amount of free media off the back of some of the paid media that we have as well. Lots of great, you know, celebrity endorsement, local TV coverage, local press. So you kind of need to invest a little bit in that to generate then, you know, that. So not to duck your question, but I don't see us dialing that down significantly. I don't see us dialing it up particularly, other than in our fundraising area, which we're going to come on to later. We have got to make big strides in growing our fundraising income. And to do that, we are going to have to turn up the resource we put into fundraising in order to, you know, unlock the funds that will secure. And clearly you have to do that very thoughtfully, but we're not going to be able to grow fundraising. We're going to start to fill the large shortfall we're looking into for the future without some resource to develop that fundraising. So that's the one big caveat I would put on the answer I gave.
Just give Richard a rest for a second. So interesting question. I think we Richard made about wellbeing messaging having done its job, and obviously it is doing its job. What we're noticing is that you know, they do need to keep that sort of that messaging going, because that is what makes people want to support trust. So donors, and I know we're talking about fundraising later, but donors and so on will be attracted to this sort of impact on the ground, what difference it makes to people's lives or the environment, or, you know, the stewardship of the historical properties and estates and so on. So that is something we definitely want to see happening all the way through. There are other things that we're dialing up in the messaging, which we think might have more of a kind of political resonance, and we'll come on to that later on, so I'll hold my thunder. But it's got to be a mixture of all of these things, I suppose.
To some extent, you've raised the point I was going to do, which is it's all right having modest money put into this. One wonders about the modest time, whether there's more time than could be over it, but it's really the political influence that well-being has. And I know that there's mentioned briefly that, and I'm not quite sure where the rest of the questions are covered at this point, but to what extent do you think politicians are influenced simply by we need to fix a reservoir, as opposed to we need to improve the quality of well-being for the country at large, and how well it succeeded in that political message.
Quick answer, I think they're more motivated by the public move than they are about the reservoir spend, quite frankly. Politicians, I mean, that may be, you know, we need them to appreciate both, but actually, I think the thing they respond to in a, you know, it's not a criticism, it's just recognise the expediency of the thousands of voices in their ear. People say, I care about my canal, I'm worried that it's not getting the investment it needs. It's quite a powerful thing. You know, it was, when Susie and I were out, and I'm sure, you know, Les and others have this too, and people say, not less my mailbag about this. You know, and that kind of course, therefore means any politician who wants to get voted back in is going to be thinking about, well, actually, we need to pay some attention to this, etc., etc. I mean, we could talk all day about, has it had the impact we wanted? Clearly, it's not had the full impact we would want. You know, there's a counterfaction about, well, if we hadn't done what we've done, would we even got the settlement that we have had the government discuss? We certainly put a lot of very hard evidence into our submissions to government to demonstrate this wider public benefit impact, aligning with all the things they talk about. So when they talk about, you know, we want to have access to nature for people, yeah, we're delivering that. You know, when we want to see, you know, mitigation against, you know, some of the other modern pressures about health or about climate, yeah, again, we can demonstrate. So we have tried to fit our narrative in against the political, you know, priorities of the day, but, you know, clearly we need to keep doing that because that job is by no means done. And as we all know, hence the purpose in a way of the campaign, we have a general election coming and we need to be very active in the run-up, at the other side, talking to people who we can get hold of to make our case compellingly, using all of this. Because it won't be one single thing, it will be the aggregation of all the things we can say to them.
I'm going to have to keep moving this on, otherwise we'll lose it.
And one question,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it was just a comment to support some of the well-being things. As you know, I've supported this over many, many years. It's like, why do people choose to walk the towpath? They can walk in a field, they walk the towpath because there's a chance of interaction. There's something pretty to look at, which means the navigation is important to their perception of what's available for them to enjoy while they're on their walk. And for many years, we've tried to get a number of, I don't mean this horribly, but like, because they are probably taxpayers, but they're not paying directly into Canal River Trust. And we've tried many times to quantify the number of people that are using the facilities that are neither counted nor contributing directly to Canal River Trust. Although they are benefiting, their well-being may be benefiting to them and those surrounding them. But of course, it doesn't help Canal River Trust, but the assets get degraded because of that.
Yeah.
It's just a observation.
I mean, the one thing I would just say, it is definitely true that the DEFRA officials, that's ongoing to the experience of the last 3 years, trying to get the review to the budget. But yeah, without that very heavy towpath use, I think we'd have a much more difficult job. Certainly the business case as such they were internally presenting had a big factor for all the people using the towpath. So that was maybe not taken account of in the way we would fully have wanted, but it was definitely a big influence on.
And to point, but people, because of the activity that's going on, there is so well known.
Yeah.
If all the canals closed, they would duck calls.
Yeah.
Different
I've
games.
always supported fishermen for the same reason.
Anyway, we can move on to question 3. Yes.
So question 3 is around the fundraising thing. And again, I'm conscious there's an awful lot in here. Just to acknowledge, and you, I think will know this, but you know, the grant is just under a quarter of our annual income. We have an endowment that yields nearly another quarter of our annual income. We have a significant chunk of commercial income from things like utilities, from cables and water and drainage and things. We then obviously have license fees and other receipts from broadly sort of commercial waterway activity through the sort of things that many of you are involved in. And then, of course, we have a very small current slice around fundraising. As I said already, one of our big priorities is to grow that slice of fundraising. Before I go on to that, obviously we still want to continue to grow those other sources of income as well. We've been very good at that, and that's not me, that's colleagues who've been here for longer than I have, at generating very good returns from our investment, from our other commercial activity. So they're fairly mature, and I suspect the opportunity for big upside in those things is quite limited, but obviously new opportunities come along, and we're very active in trying to secure those opportunities. Again, with the proviso that it clearly needs to be sympathetic to the broader purpose of the waterways, and there are new things like maybe a biodiversity net gain income opportunity. Again, we need to be alive to and alert to, so it doesn't fit into any of our current categories. There's a whole new strand. If we come back to fundraising, which I suspect is certainly part of this, we recruited a fundraising director a year ago. Maggie has been building, no disrespect to colleagues here before, because she's building a more capable team, a more experienced team. So we're motoring towards that. We are setting ourselves some ambitious long-term targets. Quite finding exactly what that would look like with the board, we're sort of dialing up and dialing that down. We're going to be moving from handfuls of millions to tens of millions over the next decade or so. And whether that looks like 25 million or 40 million or 60 million, there's a sense check to be made around that. But we certainly want to see us moving into that sort of territory.
Sorry, what is it currently?
It's about 5 million. There's a definition of the question, what you put into that. We get a lot more from local authorities, from statutory funding through things like towns funds, levelling up funds, active travelling and the like. But if you take all that out and just look at the kind of almost the public support, which I would include the lottery in that, you're looking at about 5 or 6 million. And that's what we're very focused on growing. As I said,
So of that, how much actually comes from sort of Mr. Smith or whoever it is giving a monthly donation of £5 or whatever?
About 2 million at the moment.
Did you say that was the Friends then?
Yes, that's largely Friends. We're also improving. I mean, perhaps more slowly than we would have liked. We're improving our ability to expect one-off donations as well. It's not just Friends. So, for example, the Bingley 250 event, we were signing up Friends, we had quite a good day with that, but we also are letting people do contactless payment things as well, and pretty good figures for that as well. So we want to give people the option of doing either or both.
I was recently at in York, and it suddenly occurred to me that actually, as you walk past the Minster, very nice, I have tap and pay.
Yeah.
And it's like, at some of your more popular locations, where vandalism might not be an issue, you might, it's just like, why are we using this?
I think that's absolutely something that we are and need to explore. I think our environment tends to have a slightly higher robustness threshold, frankly, in some slightly surprising places. And vandalism is by no means restricted to the more deprived areas, you get it in other places too, sadly. And whatever we do, it needs to not draw on our resources, it needs to contribute to our resources. So we are going to have targets for our fundraising income. So I guess that's a key performance indicator. We already look at things like the number of friends signing up as a key performance indicator. That will be part of it, but really that will not necessarily be the largest part of it, because we need to cultivate corporate partnerships. We need to sort of revisit some of our partnerships with major trusts and foundations. There's lottery, etc., as I talked about. So we'll be looking to set ourselves some ambitious fundraising.
So that's in the process of taking out.
Yeah, I mean, we have got some numbers, but they're sort of a work in progress.
So will those KPIs be in your report?
Something will be better, yes.
So of your appeals to people, why don't you partner with us and got up a bit? How much of the money do you think can be got with and how much without jeopardy? I'm thinking of the Anderson Lift, for example.
We debate jeopardy a lot, Nigel. I think you have to have a bit of jeopardy for people to take it seriously, but obviously we don't want this to be, boy crying wolf, house on fire all over the place.
We don't have
We
to.
kind of need to be able to have a sensible pitch to people. It's very honest. And actually, James would vote if without some public investment, we are really going to struggle to find the resources to fix that anytime soon. So genuinely, we can say iconic structure, rescue once, it really does need another injection of money. And part of that's because the lottery will give us something, we think, but it needs to be matched by something else. And there's only so much we can put into it. So yeah, jeopardy is important, but we've got to use it constructively, I think, and we're still, I guess, working out how to fix that right.
So you could do that for the Anderson Lift because the system could cope without it, you could argue. Whereas if it was Hatton Locks, it wanted to spend 30 million quid on, that's much harder.
Yeah,
Locks having not collapsed. If you've got.
It's less binary, isn't it?
Yeah. If a big structure fails and there's water everywhere, that's another category as well, isn't it?
Yeah, there's this sort of the emergency appeal almost type thing. I mean, I think we feel, and it's sort of playing with some of the questions on there, things like sponsorship. I think you can have an element of jeopardy in that conversation, but not, it's not all about that. So, for example, you're thinking about corporates, you're playing victims of corporate social responsibility, putting something back, all of that alongside, and if you don't, we are facing a point where that wider message, we're facing a lot of financial pressures that will cause something to have to give sometime. So investing now, doing something on your stretch, cuts off that very difficult. So we've got to work that narrative up more skillfully than I'm probably doing at the moment.
Because people's postcode lottery is really successful and it doesn't have it.
Yeah.
It has to look at all the things we can do together.
Well, I think it's two sides. One is creating enough fear to make people want to give you a donation because things are under threat. But also, when I looked at the fencing, you haven't got, the offer isn't that great. Why would I want to give, I might get free membership to the museum or something, but it's not natural choices, let's be honest. So, but I don't know what you mean by our museums. You've got this, like I was on the room here, I'm sure I'm thinking myself, but you can widen the appeal by sort of, take one of this, if someone's got a membership card, they can come to maybe get some benefit or something, or a marine or benefit. I'm sure you can improve the offer to make it more appealing, because there's two sides. One is robbing folks to make a donation and jeopardy. The other side is making the appeal more attractive to someone.
I agree.
Membership.
And to show you, we absolutely having that conversation. Clearly, we're handicapped compared to National Trust, and we are committed to free take-off use. So people are getting that free take-off use, and there ain't anything we can do about that. It's a great thing. We don't want to necessarily, but like it or not, we can't make it. Join up, or else you don't get admission.
It's committed, you're not committed, you're required to.
Yes, let's not debate the difference. We're 100% required to whatever. So, but you're right, we need to try and look at how we can strengthen the Friends offer. Absolutely. There's a gift aid tension. I mean, as I recall, and others might remember, 2012, we did have you can get a big discount off a hire holiday with being a friend at certain places. But I think that was taken out because we got into some challenge around the gift aiding, because it's such a big benefit.
We're still doing it, but it's not fulfillable. So it's going to have to fall apart, I think.
But we absolutely should be creative. Or what can we offer that's proportionate, that might have a bit, as you said, a bit more appeal, a bit more stickiness for people, because we haven't got that sort of slam dunk with the National Trust. If you want to come in, park your car, whatever, join as a member, and that problem is solved. So we're trying to, obviously, what our pitch is around the benefits we're delivering, and that appeal to more of an altruistic thing. It's interesting that even, I believe, charities like the National Trust are looking more towards that as being a motivator, because actually, again, thinking about new generations, etc., that kind of emotional connection is what we're all looking to get. So we don't lose that, but I agree with you, we need to try and make it as attractive as possible to sign up. And if you've got ideas, then that would be great.
Or as, this is all in confidence, this is in Melbourne News, which isn't out yet.
Oh my word, goodness me. Okay.
Sheffield's
Yeah.
very funny about it.
You need,
It is a
Yeah.
Cadanotto.
Canal
It's really good. But I mean, last year we were suggesting this, and it's never got any further. But you know, that is an answer that people do get something back from it. It's something that makes them want to, I'll give them a couple of pounds, you know, that's nice. So there is a feedback on it, there is a reward.
Yeah, all ideas welcome. I mean, you know, as we know from our experience at PPL, you get into gambling license territory, and there's quite a lot of legals around us. But they're not insurmountable, but they're not trivial either. So there's a little bit of just. So happy to talk more. Once I've received my NAB news, and I've officially seen it.
Yeah, sorry, it was an interesting idea about something.
Well, yeah, I mean, to comment on other things, so I don't want to skip over the selling to heritage assets point. Again, I think we've rehearsed this before. We manage our property estate as part of our investment. We have to look for good returns in order to fund the core network. That will mean, whilst we keep a certain proportion of non-operational heritage buildings, it is part of our strategy to find a good owner for those, where that's the right thing, case by case, to invest in something that has higher returns, so we can put more money back into the core network. And that's effectively our strategy going way back before 2012, even, but certainly since 2012. And you know, my plea is again back to this bigger picture. You have to put first getting the money into the core stuff that no one else will care for, attractive heritage buildings other people very often want and will pay above book value for, and do frankly a far better job than we can to fund their ongoing maintenance. So you know, we will always take that sensitively, do a heritage assessment before we do any sale, and have experts and heritage advisors make a judgment about that. But we will continue, just to be clear, it's being reinvested, it's not paying for today's kind of repairs, it's going to be reinvested for the long term. Commercial stuff I've talked probably enough about, but things like water transfer, big opportunities, we probably all know about the brand new canal transfer. We're very much trying to use that to secure investment in the network and the commercial side, and obviously more of that potentially where we can. Also, the ideas around charity shops, and as we talked about, we are going to do charity shops just for the ones of doubt, but those sorts of things absolutely need to have a very open mind. Sponsorship, probably back to Nigel, very keen on that. Absolutely need to find a stronger income stream from that. Get into the detail of that, but some ideas in the pipeline around those sort of things. And then finally, section 106. We've got a very good planning team. We're a statutory planning consultancy, so we get very good insight into all the neighbouring developments. We have a very strong track record of securing section 106, and section 106 is now moved to a SIL model. It's a bit harder to access. It's more jam spread, not quite so easy to attribute that development on the canal to the section canal. Biodiversity net gain will plenty as well, of course, because that would be an obligation on developers alongside canals to make some offsetting improvements in biodiversity. We're very hopeful that we will be able to capture some of that. So there's going to be lots to play for in this space, but I think we've been pretty good hitherto at securing that section 106 funding. Or sometimes it's improvements in kind. Sometimes the developer will do the work themselves, but to our scope and will ensure that it delivers the access to the towpath or improvement to that section of canal we want, but they will do the work rather than give us the money.
The reason I particularly picked up on that, we get a lot of people don't actually go the right hands.
Okay. Yeah.
People do that.
Yes. But it's certainly got harder with the civil arrangements than we had before. Boat licence increases. You all know, I think we've made a clear statement, we will be putting boat licence increases up by 3% above CPI. We are assuming in our modelling, just for the purpose of modelling, so who knows, we are assuming a small reduction in boats, so that rather than getting a net 3% increase, something like 2.4, 2.5 in our modelling. It's all guesswork, but we've sensibly allowed for the fact that if you are increasing the cost of anything, economics tells you you are likely to have an elasticity effect, and therefore demand is likely to reduce a bit. but we will see lots of other factors will no doubt affect that as well. In terms of numbers, the number I've got in my head is that not just private boat license, we take the boat license in the round, all the kind of commercial stuff as well, is about 30 million now. And the figures I was looking at this morning, by 2030, we'll be looking to get to about 45 million. So that's about sort of 6-7 years of increase, CPI +3 with some allowance for some reduction in numbers. So that's the kind of scale of increase that we're looking. So the message, of course, I want to give is we're absolutely not looking to voters to make up all the difference in everything, and we don't grow. It just has to contribute as part of this. And it is, I think it's fair to say there was a high degree of expectation in our discussion with Deborah that we would be seeking to drive income through sources like that, not exclusively boat licenses, but those income streams that were within our control. They were, it's fair to say, pretty clear that the sort of modelling that they would be doing would have an expectation of some growth in those income streams. So it's honest to point government hasn't really reacted to those plans because they kind of more or less had assumed those plans, and it's been down to us to kind of do the reality check and to develop and flesh out those plans. So they haven't changed significantly in the last 2 years. Clearly, we've been in a much more intensive and looking long-term process, going back really more than 2 years, but since about 2020, as part of that grant review process. We are, of course, revisiting all of that, have been and will continue to, in light of the grant settlement that was announced, and what that means for the overall balance of our funding and our costs, etc. So that long-term modelling is ongoing. The last question, what help or advice has government provided? Well, the offer is there. I guess it's fair to say they haven't really generated proactively very many ideas, but they're very willing to support us with the ideas we might have. So one doesn't want to be churlish, but I don't think there is a long list of government ideas.
On your modelling question, the future, the license funds and everything else, in your model, do you see it where we are numbering this as well, the sort of the arrival of the floating lodge rather than a boat on the spot, which is now something that's a cruise.
Yeah.
So there must be an intrinsic threat to your income model if lots of more income become non-cruising lodge. Does that concern you longer term? Is it something that I was on a trip last week, 3 million is something that I feel is coming to fill moorings, floating lodge, which might be argued that isn't a boat that pays an NAA sort of 9%.
I genuinely don't know, but you're flagging something that I'm wanting to there's a level of detail to know this high level stuff. I haven't had that conversation with the team, so that's maybe something we should explore. I don't know whether there's a big risk to us or not. But as you say, if there's an argument that it doesn't pay a license, then that's going to have an impact.
Really by us, one of its corners is now all floating lodges.
It's not down to the marina agreement.
Yes,
When is a boat not a boat and stuff like that, because you're taking a percentage of the inches, so it doesn't matter what.
Some detail of estimates.
I think it's probably one to.
I'm going for flagging you right now, we need to work that through. Yeah.
Sorry, I should be trying to put it as well.
No,
I'm conscious how far behind that.
Just to get it back to fundraising, we keep getting promised about the strategy, we still haven't seen it. It was supposed to be spring, now it's summer. Are we ever going to see this strategy about how your fundraising strategy is in place now?
Well, it's iterative, and so there is something in place, but it is being looked at in earnest. We're in dialogue with the board, we presented to the board last month. We've got some work to do following that presentation. I don't know what commitment we've made to publish anything, because clearly this is all quite, sensitive stuff, but I can explore that with Maggie and clarify that. It's taking time and getting attention because it's very important, and we don't want to be, we need to give it the time and attention it needs to get it right. And things are evolving, Maggie's bringing new people in, we're getting more insight into some of the things that we're doing. We've had, very successful sort of engagement around things like legacies. So our optimism around that is growing, for example. Other things we're evaluating all the time. So it's going to be, I don't think it's ever going to reach the point where it's crystallised and it's sealed. It's going to be something, certainly in the next few years, it's going to be just so low on the curve. We've got to get up the curve, and as we get up the curve, the future will then, reveal itself almost. We'll be able to say, okay, so we've had success in this area. What does that therefore mean about our expectations for the future? So it is going to be quite dynamic, I think.
I'm just still running about 15 minutes behind schedule. Joe.
Just a quick question. So when you look at all your different income streams, looking ahead at the next, to 2027, I understand you obviously want to maximise all of them, but where do you think the greatest potential is in the immediate future?
Yeah, well, so I think obviously we need to focus whenever we can. So in terms of percentage growth, it's got to come from that relatively small fundraising amount at the moment. So as I said, we need to grow our endowment return, we need to grow our commercial income. They're pretty mature, and so I think the size of opportunity there is going to be fairly limited, certainly in terms of the percentage growth we could generate. Fundraising, we're still relatively new to, we've still made relative to others, limited progress with. So we see much more upside potential to grow fundraising than to increase the others. So,
it's still quite a small proportion compared to.
It will be difficult to see how that will answer the size of the shortfall that the grant presents to us going forward 10 years plus. But in terms of contributing to, reducing that shortfall, very significant fundraising growth is central to that, and continuing to optimise the other income streams as well. So if as we have done, we can continue to beat inflation on our investment income, our commercial return, we talk about boat licenses beating inflation as well. If all of those things are going to be growing by more than inflation, and fundraising is doubling, tripling, whatever, alongside that, well, we're making some inroads to reduce the shortfall we'd otherwise face. But it won't, I think, realistically close all of that gap unless something else shifts, because there's only a finite amount of fundraising I think we can do.
Okay, thanks.
We need to pass on to question 4. After this one, we'll take a break. So we'll try to.
So that's a nice simple one. Asset management in 10 minutes. Okay. First to say, just to clarify the question. So, and this was I should be grateful. Rather than grumpy. It is unfortunate that our website refers to 2021. That's not really what it is, and we need to correct that. So that is being corrected. So in short, asset management is kind of a bit like my answer to the fundraising thing. It is ongoing. So we haven't stopped doing asset management from 2021. The asset management strategy was very much at the focus of the grant review, so it kind of got consumed into that. And coming out of that, we have not yet republished another document that would talk about the period after 2021, which doesn't mean that it stopped in 2021, it just means we haven't refreshed it. So we need to clarify that on the website. We're effectively still working on the same principles, doing the same things, projecting forward with all the new data that we talked about in my earlier answer. So that's just to clarify what we're working to.
So will you be producing a new document with new stats?
Yeah, so at some point, I mean, it will look very like the current one. Yes, at some point we will say, just kind of, that document is now showing its age a bit, lots happened, frankly, reservoirs are a much bigger part of our focus now than they would have been 5 years ago, so we need to probably, restate the strategy. But to reassure you, we absolutely have an underlying asset management strategy, and it continues to.
I think you understand. So if I'm picking up right, tell me off if I'm not chairman. So there you go. I think it's more about the condition of the assets, and actually on more up-to-date figures that Joe is pushing at.
Okay. So we report that to DEFRA, and that is in the annual report, and the underlying measures of asset condition report to DEFRA are not worse things. They're not really improving now. We have improved them over the last 10 years. We're at the point where they're largely tracking static. It's probably the case that projecting forward a couple of years, they're probably going to worsen slightly, but still be a lot better than they would have been 10 years ago. There's a debate really about whether that's a useful measure of asset condition or not. It's not wrong, but it doesn't quite tell the whole story. So we're looking at sort of other ways for our own purposes of judging where our measures should be, because what we worry much more about the reservoirs being in front and centre is the size of risk that we manage. Because actually it doesn't really necessarily matter the condition depending on the risk. So what we really want to avoid is assets with a high degree of risk in a poor condition. That's way more important than assets that don't carry that level of risk. So we need to somehow reflect that in the way we present our strategy. It's sort of implicit in the strategy now, but that's something that will very much be part of our response to how are we delivering a strategy that addresses the needs of the infrastructure, driven very strongly by risk and consequence of failure, as much as they are purely by condition.
Because in a way, the condition figure is very much the same, isn't helpful in terms of persuading government ready to move forward. It is the stewardship score, which is there as well, which I've never really understood if I was.
No.
That does show deterioration, isn't it? By aging memories.
Again, I think it's fair. Again, my memory, Leslie, I think it's fairly flat. I'm on the record as being quite dismissive of the stewardship score because it tangles up underlying asset condition with other measures around usage that are survey based and a whole lot of other things. In effect, you're putting a whole mix of not just apples and pears, but strawberries and bananas in the pot and measuring. And it's kind of, well, what's changed? And often it's not the thing that you might expect has changed. So we're much keener to have a measure of assets performance separate from things like usage and other things. So I would quite like to put the stewardship score out to sea and move on from it. It's difficult because it's baked into our 2012 agreement as part of our publication data. So we have to faithfully record it. I would like to find a way of not to sort of disclose less, but to disclose something in a more useful way, and I think that measure achieves at the moment. So we will update and share our management strategy, and it was a helpful sort of reminder in this question to do that. If I just talk to the second part of the question, just to spell out, and I think most of you know this, but obviously to spell out, we have little choice around reservoirs. So reservoirs are subject to a very strict regime under the Reservoirs Act. That means you have regular independent inspections. There's independent inspectors who are government appointed, etc. They set your requirement and the deadline you've got to deliver, and there's no debate at that point. So much of our spend is being driven by that ongoing program of reservoir inspections. Clearly, Toddbrook features as a sort of, an inflection point in this, in that it's obviously causes a lot of spend on Toddbrook and other reservoirs with some similar characteristics. But I think it's also raised the whole profile of these inspections. So it's no surprise that a lot more reservoirs are also now needing quite serious public safety investments off the back of the Reservoir Act inspections. So that has to be our priority. There's no, I'm afraid, ambiguity about that. That then leaves items B, C, and D for us to fund as the next order of priority. And clearly that's where we are more into choices. It's probably best what major infrastructure works next, because of course that bears some similarity to reservoirs in that we are managing risk. High embankments, running through the middle of towns can present a potential risk, certainly a high consequence of failure. So we have to have a very robust view about the resilience of those structures, and that will be something, again, is driving a lot of our sort of medium to long-term investment planning. But moving back to dredging, we're acutely aware that if we were to, at the extreme case, reduce our dredging to zero and throw all the money into managing the risk, we would end up very quickly with a network that was unnavigable in a number of places. So we have to spend an amount on dredging because that is necessary, and then you're into a discussion about, well, just exactly where does the line get drawn? And I think, it's fair to say that lots of people think we could spend more on dredging, and I'm sure we could, but it would have to come at the cost of something else. And so we spend somewhere in the region of 7 to 8 million a year, which we think is, balancing all the different pressures and priorities about the sustainable rate we can afford. And then again, back to the first question about supply, you know, we have a second supplier on dredging now, clearly looking to find ways of getting more bang for our buck around dredging. A lot of that's to do with what you dispose of. So the big cost is taking things off site and having to treat them through you know, specialist treatment where there's some contamination. So, you know, we're obviously trying to find whatever opportunities we can to mitigate that end of the cost as well as the actual front end. And then finally, general operational cost, which is kind of everything else, and clearly that has to be allowed for. And, you know, I would want to give you the assurance that we do obviously apply downward pressure on that where we can. I think part of our business plan process has been to set quite sort of strict challenges around some of those costs, but some things can't be avoided. So, for example, this is not that massive an issue, but it illustrates we're having to replace our SAP system. There's simply no way, I mean, eating out for years and years, we can put that off. So there's a small bow wave of spend in that kind of general management costs that we just have to spend now. And we hope it will not benefit downstream over the next 3 years. You know, there's going to be a little chunk of money within our non-operational costs. It's about that sort of one-off system change. So it's a detail, but it's the sort of detail that you kind of need to factor into when you're looking at how you balance these things. It can't all be about strict downward on management costs and, you know, overheads and support things. There are some things you have to fund there, or else it knocks back and upsets everything else, because, you know, all our asset management is done through an SAP system at the moment. So we can't do good asset management without updating that system, etc. It all sort of hangs together.
It's reservoir expenditure, which has been essential in etc. Presumably there comes a point where there isn't a need to spend quite as much on reservoirs because you've done the essential work.
Yeah.
So is that sort of 10 years time, 2 years time, 100 years time?
I'm smiling this because we've had that very same conversation, and in our long-term model, there's a real kind of, do we actually ever believe it's going to come down? Absolutely, right, logically it should, but of course, there will be an ongoing cycle of these things, and, you know, it would be quite brave to assume that the next reservoir inspector in whatever 5, 7, 8 years' time isn't going to, in the context of what, you know, is happening then, look to incrementally reduce the risk, you know, because that's what you're talking about, the reservoirs largely. I mean, obviously, Toddler was being perhaps something which kind of challenges this, but generally you're managing tiny risks and just reducing them a little bit, because there's small risks with massive consequences. So we think, to give you a straight answer, we think you're right, and then we will see a reduction in this bow wave. So the fact we're spending almost half of our current infrastructure annual spend on reservoirs, we think that will decline to be maybe something like 20 to 25%. But I don't think it's going to get much lower than that, because the cycle of reservoir inspections will roll on indefinitely into the future.
I'm sorry, when do you think it will decline down to 25%?
There's a challenge about how long the work we're doing now is sort of working through. So let's say before the end of the decade. So I think by the time we're through into sort of 2028, maybe 2029, we would hope that it's coming off the peak of the spend that we're seeing. It's not going to, you know, being optimistic might be a year or two before that. It just depends on how we can sequence the work.
The reservoir question, which obviously was a huge cost of the North Sea to keep that field. In your discussion with the government, are there any exceptions to the fact that this was something that was unforeseeable and actually deserves extra funding?
I suppose ultimately the short answer is no, not really. It was within the mix, and clearly we were making the case very strongly as part of those that projection long term of our asset management systems. Back to the question to Joanna, actually, given the grant reviews April 27 onwards, much of the cost is current next 3 years, or as it was, next 5 years when we were doing this 2 years ago. So actually, in a sense, it was a big factor. Don't get me wrong, it was a big factor for us, but it was almost a factor government could say, well, it would be less of a factor into the future grant than it is currently, which doesn't help us, but it meant it perhaps got played down slightly in the very long term.
Right, we're on to question 5 then. So back to Richard, we've got the right note.
Okay, so this isn't a very helpful thing to say, let's forgive me, but I just want to, so we didn't quite recognise the numbers, and we had Adam Conford, I can share this, I've got a graph, Adam Comerford looked again at the lockage report numbers, and of course, what happens is that we have moved over time to change the number of locks that we're looking at. So when you look at it aggregate, you get some slight distortion in the numbers. Now, I'm not doing this to try and delude you there's not been a decline, there has, although there hasn't been a decline since 2018 in lockages. So when you look at, so why am I able to say that? What Adam looked at, and you can also look at this lots of ways, Adam said, well, we've got the top 10 that's been stable in terms of the number of, so if we compare like for like, let's just look at those top 10 and see how they've changed. And that shows no change since 2018, but it does show a trend of decline going back before that. So yes, it's true that something has driven from a high point at about 2010, lockages down from, I mean, it's by about 20% since 2010 rather than since 2017. So the trend is a bit flatter, and it seems to have flattened off at the moment, but it has been down. What do I believe to be the cause? I mean, you can hypothesize. I've only got hypothesis, so there's no real firm data or evidence to draw on. Of course, the main conclusion, to take the opposite, that boats are using locks less frequently. That has to be one hypothesis. We know that volunteer lock keepers have made a little bit of an impact on sharing of locks and managing locks better, particularly at times of potential drought when we've been into some of those sort of regimes. So it's probably the case we're getting a slightly more efficient lock usage on the wide canals. Maybe. So there's a little bit of that in there. It probably is the case that people are using locks less, even if the number of boats isn't declining. Now we are seeing a greater number of boats without a home mooring, particularly concentrated around London. That may be a factor, because maybe that some of those boats are moving less than the leisure boats, and not necessarily. I can see arguments both ways, but it's a change in the mix of the boating population that may be a factor. Certainly, as I think the question reflects, there isn't a decrease in the total number of boats, certainly private boats. Perhaps need to talk to my colleagues at British Marine about the commercial fleets, whether that's changed. I guess at the margins it might have done. So I guess the question for us is, does it matter as long as boat licence numbers are increasing? Now, it probably does in the long run, because you feel at some point, although the trends are pulling in slightly opposite directions for now, does it feel that that can continue indefinitely? So it's probably right to reflect it as a risk, but it isn't something that we have been, let's say, as concerned about as other things. So there's more work to be done to try to understand the cause. Haven't got a definitive answer. I've got some hypotheses, but yes, the trend, although as I say, it just seems flattened off since 2018, has been downwards in the decade before.
Would you actually be happy to engage with the member who's done the work of Adam to
Yeah.
with them?
Yeah.
That would be very, very helpful. So if we can put the right people in touch afterwards, that would be good.
Can I give some anecdotal? So I track our diesel sales against the lock counts in the local docs to us, and our diesel sales decline almost exactly as the proportion of lock movements. So I don't buy the argument that more efficient use of locks is helping. I don't think that's really massively impacting it. I think it comes down to probably a few less hire boats, and I don't think we get away from the residential continuous cruising. That is the single driver in my mind.
It makes it very simple. It's been obvious, and it might even be right, but there is no data, because the lock count is sort of iffy, really, particularly for wide waterways. And if you take adjacent locks, you get completely different results, even when you know the traffic is going through. It isn't reliable, I would say. Not to the extent that you can say there's been a 5% change.
I mean, I guess the one counter to that, and I think that's more information than I see. And Adam would be the expert, so you're like, right, as soon as you get Adam to talk. I guess as long as the error is consistent, you'd expect the trend to still be reliable. But if it's random, it's volatile, then of course you can't diagnose anything. But I guess you probably do make a good point. I guess I have seen this, again, hypothesised by others, with the cost of diesel and other things higher, because people might feel less inclined to move, just the average person. So yes, there's a change in the population, so maybe there's a group that are moving less anyway, but the average person might decide, actually, do I really want to do that trip down the long flight this weekend? Actually, I'll do a shorter trip because not so much the locks, but it's going to save me on fuel. And I don't know. Maybe again at the margins a little bit more.
As much as normally goes, it's just like I mentioned that our diesel sales and traffic.
Yes, it's very.
I think part of the focus behind some of the questions that built into this question is the fact that the system is becoming less reliable. Also a factor here, which I think is the big question here. And so that people, the last 3 or 4 years, as Nigel knows, I've been intending to do the Rochdale and the Huddersfield, and I've given up. I've forgotten how many times you and I have had the discussion, Nigel, and I've not got to you, but
Well, there's a question later, count of days,
yeah, so I'm doing what other people are doing. Okay, so generally you're happy to have the conversations.
I mean, I think Nigel offers a very important caveat, which is this data is not entirely reliable. I mean, it wasn't designed for the purpose of giving you a definitive view, but with that health warning, of course, very happy. And I think Adam knows who it is, but so we can encourage them to. And I've got the graph that Adam produced for me last night for the 10 years, just what I can share. So not the 10 years, for the 10 busiest locks. So we can put that alongside the other analysis.
That would be useful. Okay, shall we move on from question 5? Sorry.
Excuse me, is there sort of stats about lock closures you could share with us as well?
Short answer, probably yes, John. It's a very different source from the lockages, obviously, that you then need to probably the next question, actually, which is the kind of the scale of closures on the network we're seeing. We certainly have got something we could extract from our asset management that would give us some indication of lock-related closures.
Yeah. Everyone's question 6. I've actually done one in less than 12 minutes. So
We can take longer in the next one.
Okay. How to answer this? So part of it's statements, isn't it? So okay, so there's some statements there. I'm sure the numbers are broadly right. I can't confirm the numbers exactly right. Those in that so I'm not right, but our own understanding of the numbers, obviously using our data, I'm sure that's right. I mean, we are concerned. We are concerned, as you are, that there are more unplanned stoppages, closures, whatever we call them, interruptions. Interruptions is a better word than closure. Closure has a bit fine, doesn't it? And we don't have a single slam dunk diagnosis for why. Of course, there's a myriad of things. I'm not trying to duck the fact there's obviously something about the underlying asset condition and our understanding of that here. There's undoubtedly a weather impact. Because we get very dry and very wet weather, and we're susceptible to both. And I guess I would offer the view that when you've got fairly fragile infrastructure anyway, you're getting more extreme weather that is going to exacerbate the fragility of that infrastructure. So you've got culverts that are not in great condition, if they're exposed to lots of intense sort of pressure from water through, that's going to bring about a failure more regularly than if you don't have that. So there's undoubtedly a relationship with weather. One thing I did get to have a quick look at was the number of tree-related sort of closures, and that's been on a very strong upward trend in the last 4 years. Now, I know trees, there's a role about us managing the trees, etc., but sort of like for like, the number of trees coming down causing closures is probably not a bad proxy for weather-related sort of things. So there's undoubtedly a factor here that is being driven by that. Clearly, we have got the exacerbating effect of reservoir works. So the Leeds and Liverpool has clearly been more vulnerable to water-related closures as a result of us having to do reservoir works and a series of reservoirs, also any greater problem on the Macclesfield and Peak Forest, etc. And you know, we've clearly had long sort of at least 2 summers. We've had fairly long drought closures as well, which again exacerbates whatever else is going on with the actual asset condition failures. So I'm sort of probably slightly waffling my way around some of this, but we recognise the problem. We don't fully understand it. We are spending some time with our asset management resource to interrogate specific things. So things like heel post failures on lock gates has been causing us some concern, because that seems to have increased. And there's various theories about, was there a particularly bad batch of lock gates put in 20 years ago that are now all kind of failing at the same time. It's all slightly wild speculation, but there's various things that we are trying to understand that might potentially offer some factor, but you've got to break it down really, because of course it is so many different things that are affecting the network. So we've got to focus on those similar failures on similar assets to really understand whether there is some explicable factor rather than just a whole series of things that's just aggregating into a network-wide effect. We do share the concern. Clearly there's a link to spending here somewhere, not necessarily that simple a relationship, but self-evidently, as Nigel made the point earlier, if we could spend more, then you would expect assets to be more resilient and failures to be more infrequent. So our ability to spend money on this is clearly going to be a factor, and trying to prioritise investing in things that would cause navigation closure is going to be a challenge when we're also balancing, as we said earlier, the public safety risk and Reservoir Act requirements and all those other things. So this will be at the heart of our asset management thinking and our projections going forward. But it's a worry, concern that we share.
Does navigation fall below, obviously, the requirements under the Reservoir Act and the, that comes down, lower down the
It does, because it's a criminal offence to miss a Reservoir Act. And I mean, we are often often looking at the Venn diagram of statutory responsibilities and choosing which one you're going to not meet, because you end up with this overlapping. So is it the SSSI protection? Is it some other environmental agency thing? Is it water abstraction? Is it Reservoirs Act? Is it statutory navigation? You kind of end up with pick your spot. But it's true that Reservoirs Act is the one that has the most teeth, and frankly it has the most reputational impact as well, I think, because we also what happened with Toddbrook, and clearly that sort of failure wasn't a failure in that case, but the risk of that sort of failure, is so unthinkable that we really wouldn't want to be getting anywhere close to taking that risk. Whereas, respectfully, if the navigation is closed for 3-4 weeks, it's upsetting, but actually it's not really causing us the same scale of damage as reputationally or anything else legally as a major failure in a major piece of infrastructure. So the public safety generally does have to come first.
Do you think of these things, there's enough engagement between the various voting groups and CRT, and could that improve and be developed further? Because sometimes things happen which people go, what the hell did they do that? They should have done this, not that. And that might be because of misunderstandings on both sides, of course. But is there enough engagement there and could be improved that?
I mean, the only answer has to be, I'm sure we will be open to trying. As I said at the start of this session, there's a spirit of openness and transparency here that we know you're an extremely well informed group of people in this room, and no doubt others online as well. There's no monopoly of wisdom, so I think we have got a degree of competence and expertise even in the organisation, but it's there's plenty of knowledge and wisdom and insight and experience outside of that. So we should of course want to pool information. I mean, there's a slight the one slight caveat is that I would want to just caution against diluting our authority anyway, because we can't do all this by committee. We have a navigation advisory group that Nigel's missing right now. It's taking place where we get soundings from a group of experienced boaters. We obviously talk with our boater reps on our council, and I know others attend meetings with them. Andrew, of course, is on our council as well. So we try to sort of have those conversations. It's a question of how you kind of distill all that into something purposeful rather than just lots and lots of talking about something. But in a spirit of cooperation, we welcome the input and the insight that you can give us. Yes.
Rather than trying to develop utterly further here, something FPW take away and actually try to think of a better approach to, or a different approach that might be beneficial and without trying to prejudge.
Or even make the current mechanisms work better, you don't need more forums, but
Yeah.
maybe we need to get intelligence flowing through to those forums a bit more effectively.
So, who do you think's coming?
I was just thinking back, when we've got the figures there from 2016 that showed how the fewer on Leeds Liverpool, it was closed for, compared with now. So I was thinking then, well, you've been in council for 12 years. So 10 of those sort of changes with the way things were managed. The first two, you were sort of taking over from BW and how they did things. But that seems to me when things started to get worse once BW's way of doing things was put aside. So is it worth revisiting sort of best practice from what BW was doing? Because they had a historic set of structures as well, that doesn't change. All I made of it is impacting. It's obviously easy. But there must be stuff that BW was doing to make such an incredible difference with the way that things have gone in the last 10 years. And I've heard of a boater now, a very seasoned boater, very experienced, only worked for years. And this year he's now planning his 2-week holiday, but he's going to allow 6 weeks. Now that's an awful indictment, really, of what voters can expect. So getting back to my point, is it worth looking back at what British Waterways is doing that you're not doing that might help?
There's always something to be said for looking backwards and reminding yourself where you've come from, Anne. I mean, the only obvious thing to say is, and I know you know this, but just the way you put it, there is a lot more of a continuum than you might think. We didn't change what British Waterways did. Most of the engineers work for British Waterways and are doing more or less the same work now that they were doing then. So we haven't sort of, almost like sort of phased them out and brought in a whole different approach. It's a continuation and an evolution of the approach that we inherited, because we inherited the people, etc., etc. But that's not to say there isn't something we shouldn't look back and say, okay, well, what was going on in 2008, 2009 that might offer some insight into the challenges we face today? Because we've had these canals for a long time, through various incarnations, and it would be a mistake to assume that we know everything and the past doesn't teach us. So we should absolutely do that. I'm pretty confident there is some continuity of that in our analysis. I'm also very confident we should look outwards as well. And one of the things I do think we've got a bit better at is looking outwards and understanding what's going on with others managing similar challenges. So we talked to Network Rail about earth structures, for example. We try and learn from what others are doing. We're trying to be innovative because there's technology that does make it sort of simpler, cheaper, easier to do things, monitoring stuff. So we're very, we obviously use a lot of remote alerts now that we couldn't have used maybe 20 years ago. The sophistication of the systems is better. We're trying to use drones. We're trying to use other things that give us cheaper ways of getting more data about stuff, so we can then be better at planning. But obviously that's not yet translating into evidence on the ground. And again, you're back to the counterfactual. What I can't say is, would it be even worse if we weren't doing that? Because the accumulation of bad weather, more extreme weather and underinvestment over 50 years could be, gradually causing us more and more problems. I just can't diagnose that for you. But we don't shirk the challenge of looking at our history, looking outwards and trying to learn how to do better.
I sometimes smile when I read some of the comments that British Waterways was wonderful because I turned my way. I remember some of the discussions back in the late 2000s and early 2010s about we can't get rid of this lot quick enough. So I think we have to be careful about
Maybe someone selected.
Yeah.
I mean, I offer this very tentatively because I'm not taking any real comfort from this. One of the things that our guys are tracking is the duration of unplanned stoppages. And we think we are getting quicker at opening. Now it's hard to say because of the different variability, but we're taking some comfort from our ability to get onto jobs and try to get things open again, because that's obviously one measure of success. Ideally, you wouldn't have the stoppage in the first place. I get that's the real prize, but if we can drop onto things, these reactive teams and others, and be quicker at reopening, well, that is a you know, a prize to strive for as a secondary sort of target as well. So we are trying to focus on that.
Anything else anyone wants to just pick up on this one before I move on to question 7? To question 7 then.
I think we agreed that Susan might have a go at this one, because can we give my voice a break and then Susan.
Okay, so about political work, just addressing, I'll try and address those 3 points. I think the biggest question, probably the biggest answer is around the first part of that. So what work has been and is being done with political parties, including individual parliamentarians, as we know the seriousness. So as a charity, obviously we have to be quite careful about our interaction with political parties. We can't be seen to be sort of, you know, favouring or engaging with one particular party over the others in the run-up to an election. So just with that little caveat in mind, we are doing a lot. We're doing lots and lots of work with individual parliamentarians, and obviously you know the background to this. We launched our Keep Canals Alive campaign in July last year, shortly after the announcement. Thank you. We launched the campaign within minutes, pretty much, of the announcement from DEFRA, and you all know what the announcement was. It was about our future funding from 2027 to 2027, talking about the fact that the grant was going to be reduced by 5% year on year. So that's one factor, and that's on top of an inflationary freeze since 2020. So by the end of that grant period, we will have had no allowance for inflation for 17 years. Which obviously over the last 2-3 years has been really significant. That said, the fact that we've got a settlement at all for 10 years is a big thing. There are not that many organisations that get any government funding that's had that much sort of assurance for that long. So for that, we are obviously we're grateful. The work we're doing, we tend to focus a lot on different groups of MPs. So obviously MPs with canals going through their constituencies in England and Wales, so we term riparian MPs. We know who our friends are. We've got good relationships with a lot of them who obviously want to see their canals thriving in their local communities. We obviously target ministers and shadow ministers, particularly in the right departments, although with the level of reshuffling that goes on, you know, no sooner than we, you know, got somebody up to speed with what we're doing, and they get moved off to, you know, some department that we don't really have much connection with. And increasingly in this year, we're doing work with candidates. So candidates for seats where we think they've got a chance of getting in, where the current MP is standing down or is looking very vulnerable, because as you all know, there's likely to be a massive changeover of MPs by the end of this year. So we're going to have to work with maybe as many as 150 new MPs, maybe even more. After the initial campaign launch in July, where we asked the public to write to their MPs, we saw nearly 600 MPs receiving letters from members of the public, which was fantastic. And obviously there was a lot of dialogue. We're continuing a lot of that dialogue with individual MPs who are interested in the threat. They want to know what they can do to help. Some of them are very defensive of the government's position because, of course, they're from the Conservative Party, and with some of them we've found ourselves treading a little bit carefully, because we know in their hearts they want to help. We know in their hearts they really, really care. But the sort of party position is that they've got to defend the announcement on our funding that was made. So we're trying to find ways of doing that. We have a very active programme of visits. We've got, as I think you know, we've got our 6 regional directors around the country who have people working on, you know, relationships and so on. with stakeholders, and we host as many visits as we can without impacting our operational work. So what we try and do is make sure that when we've got something interesting, we think that the MP is going to be interested in seeing for themselves, we take them along to see the operational work that's happening anyway. They can get their photo opportunity, they can understand a bit more about what we do, and they can understand a bit more about the threat of future funding. We talked a little bit earlier about jeopardy and, you know, flagging up the risk that is posed by reducing funding. So that is something that we do very deliberately with our politicians. We tend to do it more with the politicians than we do with the public, for obvious reasons. But we do want them to understand the potential implications of the funding decision. But at the same time, we need to reassure them of what we're doing in the trust to raise our own funds, whether that's through fundraising or commercial activity, and so on. So the way we see it, we're keeping our side of the bargain. We are trying to decrease our reliance on government funding, and our reliance on government funding is decreasing. The proportion of government money that we have now is, I think Richard said earlier, it's about 23.5%, as opposed to what it was, you know, 12 years ago, which was much higher, more like 40%, I believe. Well, I wasn't there then. So what we've done, we're not doing a manifesto as such. We're doing something that's a manifesto in all but name. So we've done some work to sort of, I put together a document that tells politicians what they might not know about the trust and the policy relevance of those points. So what we're trying to do is really kind of draw out those elements of our activity that hit policy goals, whether they're conservative or emergent policy from Labour. So we talked a bit about wellbeing, for example. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Minister, is extremely interested in social prescribing. So we're trying to sort of dial up what we tell Wes Streeting about social prescribing, one example. Where we're talking to the people that advise Labour on their climate and environment policy, we're talking up the positive contribution that the canal network can make to climate mitigation. So some of the activity that we're doing around data cooling, warming and cooling using the thermal energy in the canals is of interest to people who are kind of interested in the climate narrative. Many people are interested in the climate narrative, and you know what we're finding is that politicians are responding in a very interested way to what we're telling them about climate. Water transfer, obviously another big area for us, the potential of the network, if the network is open and connected, to move water around the country. So moving water from wet to dry areas is obviously a massive political interest, and you know, not just political, it's of interest to everyone in the country. So we're combining all of those quite kind of targeted messages with other work like the impact report, which you may have seen recently published, where we actually talk about the impact on the ground for communities, for individuals, for well-being, for social cohesion, and so on. So we're trying to get the balance right and put all of that together into what we can offer the government as well as what we're asking for, because we don't want to just bleat in the corner about funding the whole time. We've got to make this a partnership, and we've got to work with the government to maximise their contribution.
Susie, in addition, I think every members will be working on their own physical work. Would you find it useful for that to be closer to the IWA, British Green, certainly, and doing their own physical work? I just wonder if that's an area where we could actually strengthen against people.
I'd be really interested in that. There's, I mean, for example, I've seen some of the reports that IWA put out about, you know, the economic impact of restoration and redevelopment, and that kind of messaging. And we've done some fantastic work around that. And yes, please, if we combine messaging there, because you know that economic impact is very important. So yes,
I think you still want different messages down, because if it's coordinated, we're all going in the same direction.
Where we put the line is great. So we can share data.
More alignment. I absolutely agree, and you know we are all fighting for the same thing. So you know definitely we're going to be wanting to draw on each other's arguments. So.
There was 2 points, yeah, so just look forward to you want here, just part of the reason why, in my mind, why FW's formed, I'm very conscious that for CRT there's a difficulty in hand that feeds you really in many ways. It's difficult, that's different about scouts, but the question so that was, so I feel see that was part of FW's job to sort of be that slightly more, there's always that slightly more vociferous element, if you like. But the question I got was, in this messaging the government and other bodies, I was approached, and I think Leisure and others were by somebody in CRT to do a sort of economic case for the investment we make and the job created and all that sort of thing, which I gave some numbers around. My business and others likewise did the same. I may have missed it, I'm not always the best person to read all my emails, but has that report been issued somewhere? Is that somewhere that we can, that grows, you might get benefit somewhere?
It's possible it's gone into the impact report,
Right.
which we put out in March, so you may not have seen it.
Okay.
We also,
That's some, yeah.
The valuing waterways report produced the end of 22, including an economic impact, including job growth.
It was last year sometime, we shortly after the, set up the campaign.
there's another bit though, Rob, that's there's a lot of interest in how we calculate social value and economic value from other charitable organisations actually who are trying to do the same thing, and lots of charities put out an impact report. And what we've tried to make sure is that ours is really robust in terms of the figures that go into it. So we're making a claim, we've got evidence to back up that claim. So we've, in parallel with the impact report, we've put together something which I'm not sure is actually on the website yet, but I can check for you.
So there's an impact report out very recently that I've missed.
Yeah.
We'll have to send you a link to anything today.
There's a sort of technical analysis that goes with it, though, is what I was going to say. So it's possible that your information
Is in there.
will have fed into both, I was going to say, but yeah.
Very keen to pick up on what's been seen in this question. I realise I should actually to talk about it.
Yeah. I'd just like to dive in and give you the answer I shared with you before about the short answer is we've tried to educate them through about this and have been quite clear in our analysis and modelling of that vicious circle loop that you create. And we've exchanged about it. I think it's very interesting the piece of work in the 1960s that I didn't know about. Nigel shared it with me. But we have attempted to make the point that if you close a canal, you don't lose all the costs. Indeed, you probably keep, depending on where it is, etc., a good chunk, maybe 50, maybe 70% of the underlying cost. You have to keep it safe. You have to stop it being a threat to neighbouring communities, and of course, you will lose all the benefits. So, the point that it's a very unattractive outcome has been made. Whether it's been understood, I can't say.
Yeah, I think that the spectre of closing canals has been raised and can't be put back as bottle. I'm not sure that we're making as much positive use of it as we've been thought. I think we are making the negative use. Why would you buy a boat costing, a boat costing £200 probably, and then discover, also having discovered that the canals might not be there to do it on, it doesn't work. It works the other way around. If you demonstrate, as you've been doing, as Bushmean's been doing, what the economic value of an open canal is, this is a really big deal. You've got the actual revenue to the trust and you've got the tax revenue to the treasury, which is gigantic, and all the jobs and all the rest of it, and you can't overemphasize that, but you can turn it on its head and say, if we close the Studson bit, then the VAT receipts go down by exactly X and so on, and that might concentrate some of this money. And the other half of that is, what does it cost to close the canal? It is not a free gift, and my impression is, not having ever met any of them, that the people in Defra think that you can do that, and they quite like the idea of a water canal because it has all the ducks and some of the fish and all the people walking around, and none of the nasty spending money under the water, which what's the point of doing that? And the fact that you haven't got the boats is irrelevant. Of course it isn't, because of the money that the boats bring. It is the view, as everyone knows, that you see the boats you go along, but think of the money It's very interesting. So I think there is a case for generating and probably publishing more exactly, which is what the British Waterways Board did in 1965. They did the sums and they published them. And the consequence was, to begin with, everyone thought, blimey, they're going to close the Grand Union Canal. And then very shortly, it actually only took a couple of years, the government said, but we believe in leisure waterways, which British Waterways had been tasked with not believing in. And the consequence was really where we are today, much further on in making waterways sustainable. So I think you could pay somebody to generate with your asset information, which is now so much better developed, what it would really cost to get rid of some canals, and then the Treasury might listen.
Can I ask the question, have you ever worked with any universities on this? Thought about using economics department or whatever, the university to help support, to give some academic rigour to exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about, because governments tend to be moved by numbers, and if they want to support it by some academic rigour, as well as from commercial and charitable interests, help support the cause.
Yeah, it's a good thought, Mike. We've done a lot of different pieces of work with different universities. Don't think we've used current sort of relationship around this specific question of economic impact of closure versus the cost versus the sort of almost the 1965 British Waterways type exercise. There's some scope for that. We did deliberately use an independent consultant for the main piece of work to make our case, and it was very respected. Indeed, the team that did it had done some of the work with Treasury a few years before, so they couldn't possibly be challenged on their their kind of credentials around the methodology that Treasury would want to see. I mean, if I'm honest, that don't seem to have counted for a great deal at the end of the day, thus far, not over yet, but thus far. So maybe there is a scope for doing something. Yeah, I mean, I'll take that away and think about what we can do next. I mean, clearly, we're all thinking about, aren't we, as we plot the next 12 to 18 months, is what more can we inject on top of what we've already done? So this isn't an exercise in just what we've already done, it ain't been enough. So we have got to find more strands to this to achieve the leverage that we have only partially succeeded in achieving so far.
There is another aspect of it, which is that if you say, oh, we might have to close canals, that's actually a big threat, but it's not heard in that way.
Yeah.
If you say we're going to close the nets and stuffs, my goodness, what a lot of fuss. There isn't a waterway, even the most unvoted part of the BCN, that wouldn't create a local fuss because the locals think it's their land. And you could get a long way with that, which is dangerous, so you have to think how to do it.
Yeah, probably I've observed in my short time at the trust is that, we've got fantastic logic, fantastic argument, figures,
Yes.
analyses, figure. The problem with it is the government says, yes, but you've got to pay for yourselves. It's very simple pushback. They say, you get what you get, and any more you need, you have to raise your, through other ways and means. And, we're almost a victim of our own success in that, in that it just has been very successful since 2012 in sort of growing these alternative funding sources. So, your ideas about how you actually change that, how you get the government to accept that in this incredibly tight fiscal environment that we're in, they will actually fund some of this themselves. And Labour, every time they open their mouths, they're saying there's no new room, everything is cost. So it is really difficult. And
So what are you actually
Yes,
asking for,
but-
when you ask talking to the MPs, what are you actually asking for? Because we're having these trouble, but FPW people are saying, yeah, okay, you need more, but how much more? Or how will that work? Or, so, what are you saying to MPs? How are you specifying exactly what you want rather than very well things
So the answer to that is, we are asking, and yes, I mean, we're not making any assumptions, but of course, we've got a new prospective government in Labour, so to target at them, because the current one, we're not making inroads, and they think this is closed, so the other side of the election, we'll see, and wherever it is, we want it to be open. So our simple ask is, we don't believe the settlement was given safeguards the long-term future of our waterways. We can go around the house like that, that's our firm belief. Therefore, if you care about this stuff, all the arguments that we can muster, economic benefit, it needs to be reopened. Will you commit to reopening this? Because there's no point saying, it needs to be 3.6 or 7 point. They're not interested. It just needs to be, will you look at it? And that's what we want them to commit to doing.
Can I suggest the problem here is getting them to listen to you? Any organisation that's given some money would always like a bit more. So that's just sort of standard value. That's it. That's all you're getting. Is there an argument here for Britain's Waterways or its members to actually be making this argument separately from you, but heavily supported by you and other navigation authorities, to actually get that across, and are we more likely to be heard? Because we're not actually asking for any money for ourselves, we're asking for our waterways to be looked after, whereas you're asking for money for yourself. So is that a sensible case that we actually try and target that away from you and away from all the navigation authorities, but into this body?
It could be a better way of doing it. Bear in mind that this is different from some people who ask for money, in that if we don't get it and the canals did close, hypothetically, then who then picks up the bill? And the answer is it's the government. And is the bill smaller or bigger than what they're paying now? The answer a very great deal bigger. So there is actually, if the government ever thought about things logically, which doesn't happen, then they would be only too pleased to give you a bit, because it would be much less than the lot they would have to pay if they got it all back.
I wonder if, rather than talk too much about this, I wonder if we might take this away into a smaller group. I definitely want to see Nigel involved in that group because he's got so much knowledge necessarily from the past, but would you be happy with sort of setting up something like that?
Absolutely, of course, very much welcome. I mean, I think just to echo what Susie said a few minutes ago, is the trick with this is not to convince them of the benefits and the risks, it's to convince them that the settlement is not enough, because they are able to absorb the first half of the argument without at the moment having to accept the second. So the thing that we need to convince people is the size of the gap we're left with is simply too big to be sustainable. No matter what you assume about our fundraising, no matter what you assume about us being smarter and better, the scale of the gap in the infrastructure we manage and all the pressures that we've talked about in the last hour and a half, it's just not possible to keep it open indefinitely forever, ... You can argue about, is it a 10-year problem or a 20-year problem, but at some point you reach a tipping breaking point, and we need to convince them of that, because that's the only thing that will trigger a reopening.
And just before we move, can I just ask Susie, what reaction did you get when you made that argument to the shadow minister?
The shadow, well,
Other than say there's no money.
They don't understand our spend, so they don't know, for example, some of them don't know that we have reservoirs. So, just to be really basic about it, we've had to explain, how all of this stuff connects and why we're asking for money for reservoirs and where the water in a canal comes from and things like that. So there's been a bit of an enlightenment and, eyebrows shooting up foreheads and things. And, we had really positive conversations with Tony Perkins, who's the Shadow Minister for Nature and the Environment, and with Emma Hardy, who's the Shadow Minister for flooding and coastal communities. And our hope is that they stay in post. The risk is that the junior ministers are the ones that get carouselled around the place, so we might have to start again from scratch. But so far they've been very willing to listen without making any commitments.
And in addition to talking to the politicians, the parliamentarians, you're also having further conversations with the officials in depth at this point in time.
Not really. I mean, of course we do. Of course we do, because I've got to talk to that stuff and the grant they're paying us now, and but they don't really want to reopen the conversation unless a politician says to them they have to.
So
which is why we need someone with enough conviction to say, I know you told me this is settled, I don't believe it is, I'd like to reopen it. We need someone who's willing and able to say that.
The new secretary of state for Dan.
That's why it's really important. It's 12:45, we've got 3 questions to go. We said we were finishing.
I think we're going to be a bit short on some of these, I think, said for instance. Yeah.
But we've got an action, take away and actually try and develop.
I think that's quite important, the phrase, because you said about the messaging, not what the message is, which is about sort of, in the sort of medium long term, what we've got is not going to work. And that we've sort of finally got to the sort of, what we're all after here is the message we're going to go out and tell our MP, our councillors, whatever. So then this little last 5 minutes actually, to me, is quite key. This is where we as PM, individuals, businesses, have the message in our head that right, that's the phrase, it's 2 paragraphs, whatever it is, that we just keep backing away. And the window of opportunity is without doubt in my mind, after the election, whoever the new minister tomorrow is, who's got an opportunity for 5 years to say, well, who's good here? As a book today, in 5 years' time, it might be a benefit. So I think the last 5-10 minutes of this discussion actually has been good.
So we need that evidence from CRT to be able to make against.
I don't want in any way downplay the importance of this, because I'm absolutely with what you're saying, but we do need to move on to get through it.
I mean, we're sort of staying the same theme anyway, aren't we? If we jump to the next question, question 8. I mean, I think, I'm going to be quite dismissive almost of some of this, because I think in a way it's running too far ahead. Just to take this question first, there isn't really the scope for return to government control. There isn't really a mechanism for that to happen. So we should, I mean, I think Nigel said earlier, it's kind of right when you play all the way through and the trust collapses and the trustees resign and, council disappears and, well, it sort of ends up somewhere, but there isn't actually a mechanism for us to say, do you know what? We've had enough of this, back to you. That mechanism does not exist. You can't reverse what was done in 2012 unless it literally is kind of complete disintegration and rubble everywhere. So it's not
because you can't say if a waterway works, you can't say, well, actually this is a problem, but we'll keep the ones that are
no,
then it would be your problem. So you're the trust for looking after a closed waterway. It's absolutely a disaster.
Yeah, it's a scenario that we haven't really entirely worked through, but just simplistically, there's not a mechanism to say back to you. We changed our minds. That doesn't have an option.
There are lots of people out there who believe that option. It's the practicalities of it are an entirely different thing. Is there any way in a few simple words that could be explained somewhere along the line? Because I think that would be actually helpful, because the people who think British Waterways were absolutely wonderful and got the laugh earlier, that's just been, okay, we'll get rid of this lot, British Waterways come back, it's all wonderful. I think it's important people do understand that it's not as simple as that.
Okay, and then we've obviously talked a bit about the other items already. So we aren't, just to be clear, this is this tightrope we talked about earlier, we aren't getting into any detail around closures of waterways. For us, it's the last resort, the unthinkable, inexorable outcome of not achieving a sustainable funding position. And of course, there's lots of moving parts to that. Yes, we've got to raise fundraising. Yes, we've got to do this. But ultimately, if you can't put together a big enough pot of money, with a key part of that being the government grant, you ultimately reach the point where you simply can't keep them open. So there's not a plan to close, it's almost the default. The default is you just can't keep them open.
But when you talk about that, you say it's not enough current settlement, settlement from 27. What you don't say, you argue it's unsustainable, but we're not putting any timelines on it, are we?
Well, we can't, Joanna, really, because I mean, the dilemma for us is almost against your nature. We are constituted to do everything we conceivably can to keep the network open, attractive. It's in our kind of core purpose. So with our last breath, almost, we will be trying to do that. But everyone else, and in a way, this is the separation between us versus you, who cares about having something viable, workable, usable, needs not for us to be getting to that dying breath, because that's the point at which things will close. So we're never going to make a proactive plan for closure, I don't believe, because that would concede the very thing we'll keep fighting for. But realistically, that is going to become more and more and more of an uphill struggle. And at some point, I can't say when, because we'll be being as creative and as skillful as we can be, you do reach a tipping point, I think, with the current settlement. But I can't say when it will be. So, yeah.
Can I just ask then,
You give the message very clearly that closing canals and waterways is your last resort. But if you go and talk to boaters in marinas or wherever, people meet, they say, oh, but such and such has said that, you know, there's a concrete plan to close the Lees and Liverpool or whatever it might be. Is there any way that together we can combat that?
Happy to try. Happy to try. I mean, I've realised that controlling what the towpath telegraph says is very difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. But no, if you, and again, it's that, again, I know people get frustrated with us about this fine line on the messaging. We can't make it be complacency. Well, they said I'm going to close it all fine. No. No, it's really not fine. But the prospect of closure is a distant one, one we're working hard to do everything we can to avoid. It's not anything that we will do lightly, etc., etc., etc. If we can find the way of saying that, please.
It's become apparent to me whilst we were at Leeds actually that a lot of the public do not know that CRT is responsible for reservoirs. Can we do more about putting out who is responsible for what? When we said about the reservoirs, they were saying, well, that's Yorkshire Water.
Yes.
No, it isn't. It's CRT.
So it is.
So I think possibly we need to do something with the general public, not just politicians, to actually say, yeah, we are responsible for this, and this is prosperous. And what it is,
yeah, I mean, I think you take the point tonight, I share your view. It's over social media over the last few weeks, months, we've been trying to sort of broaden out the coverage a little bit. So, so some of these themes get sort of just fed in a bit more regularly on the website and the way we talk about it. But I think there's some way to go. I completely think it's difficult to, tell people on the towpath, did you know? Well, I suppose we could. Did you know that water this canal comes from such and such a reservoir? Maybe start thinking about that kind of thing.
I mean, I would love it if FBW could actually have enough people to get into the schools and get the school kids writing to their MPs. Because I think that would have more clarity and get them realising Leslie's grandson, their school, did a wonderful presentation on the waterway. And if we can get more children involved, it's raising the profile of children.
Quickly, Les, isn't Waterways locked etc. on Key Stage 2, or have I missed a generation in schools? In the school.
There's hooks out for sure. So we do have a very
You do?
yeah, we do have a very successful, albeit limited by the art of the possible in terms of funds and resources and everything, a very good education programme.
Yeah.
I know others do as well. And water safety is a part of that, but it goes beyond water safety. So yes, I mean we clearly influencing people at an early age is good, just to make them aware of what we do, even if you can't get them writing to a piece, I'm not sure. But anyway, we can certainly get them to know about it and badge their parents about it or whatever. So
one of the things that comes out this discussion of the waterways is Richard has made a really strong statement that the last thing he wants to do is close their canals. Now, if you walk out onto that towpath out there and talk to a number of boaters, you'll get sort of, well, all CLC want to do is close all the canals, get rid of all the boats because they're just a bloody nuisance, cost a lot of money. And I think that message that the last thing CRT want to do is close. And Richard's gone quickly on the record effectively here today. Unless you want to sweat it like that out, which I don't want to. Seriously. I think making that statement have a lot of benefit. I think there's a lot of people who just don't believe that.
right,
I don't know if anyone else thinks I'm quite in favour of that.
last question. I was going to move on to C and D, but just very briefly try that.
Yeah, I just don't want to miss E. 18.
Okay, there's needs, sorry, forgive me, yes. I'm going to just, we probably talked enough about C in the earlier discussion around funding. Other, please detail. Well, I guess the only real other is what we're doing to make the organisation more efficient. And we are. It's hard to say. Definitively, we're doing as much as we can because there's always more you can do. But we are very mindful of the need to be innovative, to be entrepreneurial, to find smarter ways of doing things. We've done a big review of our operation and maintenance through the winter to try and tease out what we could do differently. It's an absolute central role for volunteers in that, without relying too much on volunteers, but finding roles where volunteers can help us stretch the resources further, etc., etc. So we are trying to do as much as possible. But of course, again, ideas always welcome. And then jumping on to E, I mean, I think it's more constructive to say we need to have this reviewed again, sort of the way we just talked about the decision on the other side of the election. This needs to be re-examined. We need the assurance that there's enough funding. We don't believe there is. Let's look at it again, because it's not straightforward, because you've got so many moving parts, and there are choices to be made about the level of risk you can tolerate and the other objectives you're pursuing and all. We just think that needs to be re-examined with a simple statement that the size of the cut that we're facing is too great. So we don't need necessarily the entire amount plus inflation restored. Clearly, government wouldn't buy that, and that would look like reduced dependency. But there's something between being fully restored to everything and what we've got that we need to settle on in a discussion with a government that would be interested and engaged in making sure we have a sustainable future. That's what we want to try and engineer, and that process would come out with, and there probably would need to be a negotiation. There was back in 2011, 2012, before the trust was created, about exactly for how long, and all those sort of things. What will you sign up for? What are you delivering in return, and all those sort of things. We just need to have the opportunity for a constructive dialogue about.
So you don't get, there's no figures you can have on the short.
Well,
because of what you've said, but we need the evidence that the current settlement is too great, I suppose.
I mean, I suppose that's a very key point, because you need to have the conviction about it. I guess it's difficult to provide evidence to prove a negative. We can demonstrate to you the size of the shortfall that opens up and how implausible we think it is that other sources of income can fill that gap, and then the consequence of a funding gap that obviously therefore means we haven't got any money to spend, what that does to the network, and clearly something going to. So we can walk you through that.
That would be really, really helpful.
Okay. We can try and do that. Yeah.
Sorry, I shouldn't have written that last time.
That's the news movement. Oh, file for the biscuits, huh?
Oh yeah, the other thing I'm going to say is part knew that this was going to happen and went to the grant. That the grant was going to decrease, and yet they haven't planned for it, which is evident because they haven't got money. And that is a bit of a difficult one to say, but how
Okay.
okay,
so
next time at the lock I get that one.
So again, some of what we already said, but just to restate it. So we always accepted that there would be reduced dependency, they're the magic words in the agreement, over time on government funding, providing the opportunity for a new charity to unlock new sources of income and other ways of doing things. We have seen those other sources of income grow, significantly more. We talked earlier, we're now down to less than 25% in grant. We are committed to a trajectory where that trend of reduced percentage proportion from grant would continue. So that is to honour the original conception of the trust. What was supposed to happen, a bit outspoken in the review, is take a proper appraisal of where we are now in light of all the things that changed in the first 10 years of the trust, emerging issues like reservoir safety risks, like the impact of climate, our relative success or otherwise in growing income from other sources. All of that, in my view, should have been part of a comprehensive reappraisal that would then say, okay, we now know where the trust is 10 years in. To continue to be sustainable, we need to agree a settlement going forward that looks like this. Now, Defra may argue that's what they did. I don't believe they did that, because there's no, why do they publish a page and a half rather than something more comprehensive? There isn't any actual thinking that says we believe there is a sustainable path coming out of this settlement. The settlement was just, yeah, and I don't think it took account of what the whole thing was based on, a partnership with government to provide the long-term, sustainability of the network. We didn't arrive as an independent charity with a new cause. We were spun out of government with a mission to do something in perpetuity. Government has a lot of value from. We heard earlier about whether it's public benefit, whether it's tax receipts, whether it's managing risks around public safety. All of that matters to government, and therefore it needs to have a sustainable model that goes forward beyond the first 10 years, the first 15 years. And that's my answer to people who say we have been working as hard as we can to achieve reduced dependency. That's why we've been working as hard as we have at all the income generating things. Some success, but not 100% success, you might argue. But things like reservoir costs have emerged. The pressure climate on the stuff we're talking about, we're spending more every year on unplanned works because of easing all cutting and the rest of it. All of that needs to be part of the calculation, and it's not unreasonable for us to say to government, we know a lot more now than we did in 2012, and we need to take a fresh look at what the future trajectory needs to be to enable us. This is Michael says, it's going to cost them more if we fail. They need us not to fail.
Put that in a statement.
Well,
Neil's already got it.
So, a lot of people do seem to feel the government gave this 15-year deal in 2012 and was suggesting that was the end of it. I don't think that was ever the case. They said it would be reexamined or whatever after 15 years. And I think it's pretty disingenuous of being able to say, well, we could give it to everybody, so we didn't need to give you any. And I think that's what the whole straight personally for the government, but whatever colour it may be, because I think to anyone who was involved in the Waterways, it was patently obvious that settlement in 2012 was not that generous. But there have been a lot of things that have changed in the last 10, 15 years. And that if you want this national asset to carry on, then there's got to be some national funding.
But certainly the settlement didn't say we'll give you more money, did it?
So there would be a review.
But they didn't agree to more money. Everyone wants more money. That's the trouble we're up against.
Which is why it has to be driven by the analysis. I completely get. Of course, you would never. I mean, I think it's amazing that Treasury signed for 15 years in the first place. And that actually we've been able to secure another 10, even though it's a bit of a poison chalice because it's 10 at a sort of rate of decline that we don't much, we really can't live with. But we have to base it on need, and it needs to be, as we said, it's about the paradigm in the mind, if I can put it that. You care about this stuff, it needs to be sustainable. Let's work together to make it sustainable. Not, it's your problem, and if you don't get enough money, tough. Well, it's not our problem, it's a national problem, because all the national impacts it will have. It needs to be genuine. I know it sounds a bit sort of, false almost, but we genuinely want a partnership with government that acknowledges what we can realistically do and what they therefore need to meet us halfway with to achieve that.
So I'm not actually suggesting this at all, but it's fun to think about. Put a strapline on all your branding which says managing the waterways for the government.
Managing the waterways in the UK.
We've got two questions.
Can I just ask something on political engagement and government, and what about your engagement and work, and how helpful can local government be? I worked in local government for 17 years, and obviously, even with the Highways Agency and what you're doing with your reactive maintenance, there's lots of cost savings and stuff. And also in lobbying central government, working together. How close a relationship are you having there with local government?
I mean, it's obviously much more disaggregate.
Yeah.
So it's lots of things. We have lots of good relationships. Of course, financially, they can only really fund us if they extract it from somewhere else. But there's some of that, where local government has secured money. We've had local support from some. So one of the things I was most pleased about this summer was when the 7 London councils, from Westminster through to Tower Hamlets, wrote a joint letter to DEFRA saying, we all care about this enough to ask you to put more money in it. We can think about their own needs, and yet they were willing to come together to ask for something, you know, for us. So that was a real, you know, heartening thing, and we see echoes of that elsewhere. We've got to continue to work it because it's a never-ending thing, isn't it? And you know, we've got relationships with the West Midlands Mayor, with the Greater Manchester Mayor. We haven't really broken through in West Yorkshire. We need to keep trying there. And we've got so you know, we've got to keep finding anyone who has an interest in this stuff.
There was a question, to an extent, your statement earlier answers a lot of this.
Well, I think, and this is not to be rude, but I just don't think we want to go down the route of 9, because it starts to open us up into the prospect of actually planning a closure. And I mean, there may come a time when we're much, much closer to the cliff edge than we are now, when this becomes unavoidable, but it isn't now. And I don't want to turn this into an active plan for closure when everything about what we want to do is to be on the front foot averting closure. So that's kind of what I want to say on that, really. I mean, I understand the factors, and clearly in our thinking, we of course would understand, you know, cost, impact, you know, all the kind of factors that sort of underlie it. But it's not something we're entertaining as an active piece of work.
I think it's the last thing you want to do is close it out, actually answers the question in itself.
It's all about averting closure, not planning.
So does anyone want to pick up on that? This is my biggest success so far. Question 10 goes down a similar route, but obviously restoration is an area where we bring new benefits to Waterways to the nation with restoration, CRT and British Waterways. Before them have different extents been supportive of that. And obviously the restoration societies are feeling quite threatened at the moment. This question was built from a question from the Chesterfield Canal.
Yeah.
So again, to an extent, your comments on closure.
Yeah, I made a slightly unspoken remark at the Northern Canals meeting in the autumn, which probably, was probably the cause of some of the disquiet. But actually, what's important with restoration society is not to take the rest of the network for granted any more than anyone else. That was my slight fear, not with the active societies themselves, but some of their stakeholders, as they just see it in isolation. It will be great to have this last bit. Well, that's great, but only if you'll continue to invest in the bit it needs to join on to. And you know, almost inevitably, the bits they're joining onto are themselves the last bit that was restored. So in some senses, they're most vulnerable because it's sort of been already added onto the network. So you know, it's really important that restoration societies, and I think that, and this is no complaint, absolutely, but just for the avoidance of doubt, need to embrace we're arguing with the whole network with our bit added, not just trying to argue for our bit, ignore the problem, what we're adding up to. Because that I think we're to lose sight of the fact that it needs to be, you know, incrementally added to a viable, sustainable network, not sort of, you know, we're going to close our mind to the bigger problem and just try and get our thing done, and almost compound the problem of how do you convince people because they see something being restored. I think, well, it must be, it's fine. No, we've got to make sure it's all fine, rather than see it in narrow slices.
Well, the last thing I'd want to do is put words into your mouth.
Yeah.
To an extent, 9 and 10 go hand in hand.
Yeah, they do.
Would it be fair to say that your view would be that it's really important that both business and restoration societies support a whole big campaign to keep waterways open? Because you know, they have to give obviously there are downsides for businesses and the like, but would you agree that it really is important that everyone in the waterways, it's only Waterways World, I don't mean the magazine, come together to actually support the need to campaign to fund the whole system at an adequate level so we don't get into this gap where closure, the last resort, becomes necessary?
Yes, I agree. I do. I think you knew I'd say that, but yes, I do. And just to sort of say something slightly more positive, I think it is fantastic that we have active restoration societies making a case, because actually it galvanizes people to have the case made, and that absolutely generates more of the the positive sentiment that you can recycle back around to the core network. So I don't want to sound like I'm being underwhelming in what the Restoration Society is doing, but I think it freshly makes the case. You know, when you look at the numbers around some of the more recent restorations, that gives you some of the data to say, here's why canals are good, because they didn't used to have this, and now it's back and look. And we can do more of the same as, you know, the Cotswold reopens and, you know, the Chesterfield opens a bit more, and Terry Cameron does a bit more of the Buckingham, and all those things make the case for why we want these things in the first place.
As indeed was made in Country Fire, where
Yeah,
Terry was.
absolutely. Terry on Country Fire was a perfect example.
If we get back about a year, we were both at Staveley Basin on Chesterfield, and I was very struck at the time by the FPW had just been announced. How Rod Alton actually stood there and said how important it was, because the restoration societies appreciated just how much they could see the threat to them. As we've got the chairman of the Waterway Cabinet since do you want to comment on this area? Well, it's not going to take you
Terrible, that makes it feels like you've just fed me a feed line. Absolutely, that is the purpose really of the Waterways report, Waterways go today. To actually, just to give you a quick thing about the origin of it, it actually came out of the restoration side of IWA. The restoration side was saying we would love to have a document that explained why waterways to be are valuable to the nation, not just to a few niche groups. Apologies to anyone I've offended there. And actually, as it was being written for restoration societies, it became quite apparent, strangely enough, the benefits to the UK are the same whether they're being restored or whether they're not being called out. And that's the purpose of that document, is absolutely, it's the IWA's snapshot of what waterways are worth to the UK. And that's the purpose of it. And the arguments apply to both navigable and restoration. Will be nice and right.
I agree with Mike very much. I'm just concerned. The strapline that we've got today was, you know, last thing CRT wants to do is close canals. Maybe too many people see the last thing CRT wants to do is open new canals because of the costs attached to that. How do we engage with the additional costs of improving that?
So thank you for feeding me that line, Mike. It's a really good point. If David or my chairman were here, David, I know, would want to say very positively, absolutely we want to support restoration, because he absolutely says that now in every speech that he gives, not satisfied with just some sort of minimalist, keep what we've got. No, we absolutely want to support, you know, its expansion where there's, you know, a will and an appetite to do it. And we absolutely do want to be positive about that. But, and I think the restoration movement understands this, we can't be offering, you know, free gifts around this. Every bit of restored canal has got to wash its face as a viable proposition, not just the day it opens, but for the years ahead, so that as it is integrated with the network, if that's the right answer, that whether we are the navigation authority or some other entity continues to separately manage it, it has to be a viable thing for us both, rather than any assumption that we will somehow carry it forward and inject a lot of cost, because we won't be able to do that. And I think people understand that. I'm very reassured. I know it's the restoration conference this weekend, and I'm sure everyone there will reaffirm this, but that's the reality check it needs. And it may have always been the case. I'm not decrying the past, but there's maybe a bit of a sense of, you know, they were being restored quite quickly, really, weren't they, 25, 30, 40 years ago? And actually, it probably wasn't the same mindset that said, oh, actually, how do we make sure we've got the resource? Well, now we have to be very clear that that's part of the deal. They have to be viable as additions with enough, you know, funding to add them sustainably.
I think that's been understood generally by restoration for 10 years.
I was going to say, that's been the message for at least a decade. We have to be idiots not to hurt. Doesn't mean to say you want to, right? But that's another good example of why we are all in this together. Oh dear. So I apologise for saying using that phrase, but by restoration, we need to prove that they all, to use the terrible phrase, wash their face.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone else want to ask anything?
Can I just very quickly just I mean, I remember it goes without saying, and we will continue to provide support for restoration, largely in the form of advocacy, largely in the form of, bits and pieces of, guidance where we can. And I think that's, again, to take Mike's point, very clearly understood. We will continue to play that role. Obviously, we have a slightly bigger stake in those where we have ownership, but we generally want to partner, but albeit being quite reserved about where our costs can go. We have to keep our costs on the corner, by and large.
So the message to restoration societies is keep on all the good work that you've been doing for many
Absolutely.
years.
And keep talking to us, because we'll very happily keep talking and being part of the conversation.
Good on all of you for
Yeah.
fantastic work you're doing. So, okay. Right, we've got to the bit that I have at 12:55 on the agenda, so I'm only 20 minutes, or 25 minutes behind. So, as you remarks, Richard, do you want to say anything?
I'm just thank everyone for their participation today. I think people have said that it's felt like a useful session, certainly parts of it. I hope I've done my best to give you as direct and unguarded and clear an answer as possible. Really value the partnership opportunities from funding Britain's Waterways role alongside ours, and what we need to do together in the future. So thank you everyone for your attendance and your engagement and your support and your partnership in working on this campaign together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. From my perspective, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, to remind that they're working, making sure it happens. I'd like to apologise to anyone online who may have had trouble hearing. Our lovely assistants department has been moving the mic as and when you can. Never sure if I can call you my lovely assistant now, my apologies if I'm offended. And I think it's the point that we've sort of agreed, I think, all the way through, Richard, that if we come and ask for something, we can work together and you can give us things. So I think from our next steering group meeting, which is in a couple of weeks' time, I think, we will actually come up with a list of things we'd like to do.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to you with that. Is it to you, or is it to Susie, or to both of you?
Both, either, yeah. And I'm conscious there's other dialogue going on. So I won't be the restoration conference on Saturday, but Julie will, and I think others. So talk to them, those who are there. So we don't want this to be a narrow funnel. This needs to be a wide conversation. But yes, of course, particularly on the campaign, Susie and or me, and we'll then make sure that we generate a response.
And then finally, thank you again for the hospitality here today, which is appreciated. And for everyone that's listening, please do everyone you possibly can to become a member of Waterways. Please also get everyone you know to sign the petition. We're over 50,000, we want to be well over 100,000. There are lots of people who care about Waterways, as we've also today. So please do that. We're over 125 member organisations now to pick up here, and we can do an awful lot more, particularly trade and diverse interests. Thank you very much, everyone. I think that's it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.